For centuries, the devoted followers of Jesus have scanned the sky for falling stars, the sun becoming darkened, the moon losing its light, among other signs that might signal the advent of the Messiah of the latter days, the returned Christ Spirit. The source of the prophecies of these signs being expected before he returns are found in the book of Matthew, chapter 24, as well as in Mark and Luke. This video will explain the meanings of these prophecies and how they have already been fulfilled. But note, this is part one of a two-part set of videos. This explanation of the meanings of these prophecies and warnings of Jesus is complex, and how they have been fulfilled is also complex. That means that these videos are lengthy. And please don't forget to watch part 2 after this. It may be helpful to watch the videos in segments as needed. The description in YouTube for this video gives the time markers for the start of the sections that will be described a little later in this video. Is your memory a little fuzzy about the prophecies in Matthew chapter 24? Well, here are some reminders of the happenings and prophecies in 24. The disciples asked Jesus what the signs of his coming, the second advent of the Messiah, would be. Jesus speaks of the coming abomination of desolation, and persecution, false prophets would be coming too. The great tribulation, otherwise known as distress or oppression, will occur. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give her light, the stars will fall from heaven. Then the Son of Man will come in the clouds of heaven. His angels will come with the sound of a trumpet, and more. So please join me for this true story of how these prophecies have been fulfilled. It is an entirely new and logical way of looking at Bible prophecy fulfillment. And yes, it means that the Christ Spirit has returned, just as Jesus promised he would. This video will explain when and how he returned and the evidence that the prophecies in Matthew chapter 24 have been fulfilled by two divine messengers. First, the herald, the Elijah figure, just as John the Baptist was, and number two, the Messiah of the latter days, the returned Christ, and also the Jewish Messiah, and also, by the way, the promised one of all the major faiths on earth. Now for a little recent history to give you some background. On May 23, 1844, a young man in Shiraz, Persia, announced that he was the promised one, but also the herald of one greater than he, that he called him whom God shall make manifest, meaning the Messiah of the latter days, who would soon appear. The divine title of this young man was the Bab, which means the gate in English. The Bab was born in 1819 in Shiraz, Persia. He was a descendant of Abraham through Hagar. He also was a descendant of the prophet Muhammad. The Bab spread the word that God had a new message for this day, and the Messiah would bring even more good news when he would appear. Many, many thousands of devoted followers arose from every part of Persian society, to the dismay of both the Muslim clergy and the government led by Muhammad Shah Qajar. The Persian government, upon promptings from the clergy, put the Bab to death on July 9, 1850, in Tabriz, Persia. This is a photo of the shrine of the Bab on the side of Mount Carmel in Haifa, Israel. This is the final resting place of the Bab, and the site of pilgrimages from the followers of the new faith from all corners of the globe. Through that gate, the Bab, humankind would attain the new Messiah, whose divine title is Baha'u'llah, which means the glory of God in English. Baha'u'llah was born in 1817 in Tehran, Persia, the son of a nobleman who was a minister in the court of the Shah of Persia. Baha'u'llah was a descendant of the last king of the Sasanian dynasty of kings of Persia, as well as a descendant of Abraham through both Sarah and Keturah, two of Abraham's 3 wives. Baha'u'llah initially was a follower of the Bab, one of the Bab's chief disciples. The Persian government launched a deadly vendetta against the followers of the Bab. They were called Babis, in which thousands perished, sometimes from disgustingly brutal methods. Baha'u'llah was banished from his homeland and sent into forced exile to Baghdad, which was then a city in the Ottoman Empire. That was in early 1853. After 2 additional forced exiles from Baghdad, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire banished him and several others to the prison city of Akka, Palestine, also known as Acre. This is a map of the Middle East as it was at the time of the Bab and Baha'u'llah in the mid to late 1800s. On the right you can see the western part of Persia, that's the area that has the greenish background, and the Ottoman Empire, that's the dark tan areas. It shows the exiles of Baha'u'llah, the red and yellow line that starts in Tehran, Persia on the far right. Baha'u'llah was first exiled to Baghdad, where he lived for about 10 years. Then, at the request of the Persian government and clergy, the Ottoman Empire removed him further northwest to Constantinople, now called Istanbul. But that did not stop Baha'u'llah from guiding his followers, now called Baha'is, even from Istanbul. So Persia still pressed the Ottomans to do something about him. So the Ottomans sent Baha'u'llah to Adrianople, now called Edirne. This still was not satisfactory to the enemies of Baha'u'llah and his faith, so they sent him to Akka, Palestine, which was a prison city. The conditions in that prison cities were so deplorable they thought for sure he'd die and his religion with him. Baha'u'llah arrived in Akka, Palestine in 1868 and entered the city through the sea gate. He would never leave that area for the remainder of his life. He passed on to the Abha kingdom, heaven, in 1892. Abha kingdom means glorious kingdom in English, meaning heaven, the spiritual realm. Basically, Baha'u'llah was imprisoned or under house arrest for the most part of 40 years, all because he claimed he brought a new revelation from God. His burial site and shrine is outside the city of Akka. This is the sanctuary of Baha'u'llah, his final resting place after a life of suffering and devotion to the revelation that God sent him to teach to us. His ministry on earth lasted for 40 years. Some additional information here about the Bab and Baha'u'llah, because they may very well be very new names to you, so I want to introduce you to them as shortly and concisely as I can. So the Bab means English, in English, the gate. Some other divine titles for the Bab from the Bible are the return of Christ in the station of Elijah, the herald and forerunner of the Messiah of this new era, and he is the Lamb of the book of Revelation, and he was a thief in the night. He was born in 1819 in Persia and died by firing squad by order of the King of Persia in 1850. And he made his first proclamation of his divine identity in 1844, Common Era. Next, Baha'u'llah, which in English means the glory of God. His other divine titles that you might recognize come from the Bible. He's the return of Christ in the station of the Father. He is the Messiah of the second coming, or the Messiah of the second advent. He is the one who sits on the throne of the book of Revelation. And he too was a thief in the night. They were both thieves in the night because they taught their new revelations, and then they passed on to the heavenly realm with fairly few followers at that time. And even now in this year of 2022, so very few in the world ever knew they existed. Now, the Baha'u'llah was born in 1817, passed away in the Holy Land in 1892. He proclaimed his identity as the Messiah for this new age in 1863. He actually had his revelation of his being the Messiah while he was imprisoned in the year late 1852. As mentioned, Baha'u'llah's name means in English the glory of God or the glory of the Lord, and it was prophesied as coming throughout the Old and New Testaments of the Holy Bible. Some of the verses where the glory of God or the glory of the Lord is mentioned are listed on the next slide. Here are just some of the references to a very special entity titled the glory of God or the Lord in the Bible. I'm not going to read them to you. You would have to pause this video to write these down if you are interested in investigating them further. Here are a few examples of some of these references to the glory of God or the glory of the Lord, meaning Baha'u'llah, in the Bible. First one you see there is from Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 28, quote, "As the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud in the day of rain, so was the appearance of the brightness round about. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell upon my face, and I heard a voice of one that spoke." End quote. And from Isaiah chapter 35, verse 2, quote, "It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice, even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given unto it, the excellency of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the excellency of our God." End quote. Third, Revelation chapter 21, verse 10, quote, "And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain, and shewed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, and her light was like unto a stone most precious, even like a jasper stone, clear as crystal." End quote. And then fourth, from Revelation chapter 21, verse 23, quote, "And the city had no need of the sun, neither of the moon, to shine in it, for the glory of God did lighten it, and the Lamb is the light thereof." End quote. The last two are especially indicative that something is very special regarding the return of Christ and the phrase, "the glory of God." The new faith that resulted from their lives and teachings is the Baha'i faith. There are about 10 million Baha'is in the world, located all across the globe. There's about 170,000 of us in the USA. And the world center of the Baha'i faith is in Haifa, Israel, on Mount Carmel. Just to assure you that this is all real, here's an aerial photo of the main administrative buildings of the Baha'i World Center on Mount Carmel in Haifa, Israel. I visited Haifa on religious pilgrimage in 2010. I've been in 3 of these 4 buildings and walked in the gardens surrounding them. They are very real. The Baha'i Faith's World Center is in Israel because the last 24 years of Baha'u'llah's life was spent as a prisoner of the Ottoman Empire in Akka, Palestine, which was used as a prison city for the Ottoman Empire at that time. Akka is across the Haifa Bay from the World Center's location on Mount Carmel in Haifa. At this point, this is all I'll tell you about the Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i Faith. Much more will be explained as I review in this video the fulfillment of Matthew 24 prophecies by the Baha'i Faith founders and their faith. Here are 3 websites should you wish to learn more about the Baha'i Faith, its founding figures, history, beliefs, community, among other points of interest. The 2 websites at the top are good starting points to get some information about the faith and its main figures. The top one, Baha'i.org, is the official international site of the Baha'is of the world. The Baha'i.us website is the official website for the Baha'is of the United States. If you are interested in reading some of the sacred and authoritative texts of the Baha'i Faith, there is a free online library through the website at the bottom there, Baha'i.org/library. And I thought I'd share with you this book on the prophecies of Jesus in chapter 24 of the book of Matthew as a source among many others of the information in this video. It's the Prophecies of Jesus, and the author is Michael Sowers. His scholarly yet very easily read and understood book was a great source of information and helped enormously in my understanding of the Bible. I highly recommend it. It's available through Amazon.com and probably some other online bookstores. This is the table of contents for this 2-part video. Section 1 is a fairly brief introduction to Matthew chapter 24 and to the 2 divine teachers who fulfilled its promises, the Bab and Baha'u'llah. We have reviewed this information already, so we'll check that section off as complete. Section 2 will be some background information on the Bible version used in this video and why some important translation changes have been made from the first occasionally incorrect English translations from the original Greek text of the Bible, and then a few tidbits of information about the meanings of some of the terms in chapter 24. Section 3 is incredibly important. Nowhere in Matthew 24 is any kind of time frame given for these foretold events. However, there are some time prophecies in the books of Daniel and Revelation that give us a definitive year around which to place these events. So we know what year it is to expect the Messiah. And it was around when the Bab and Baha'u'llah showed up. Section 4 is simply a read-through of chapter 24 without any additional commentary. It's only going to last a couple minutes, but you probably could use this review. You can always fast forward through it if you don't need that review. Section 5 is a tiny introduction into Matthew 24 as a whole. And in section 5a, we get down to the nitty-gritty on the prophecies and how they were fulfilled. The second video in this set of 2 videos on the subject of Matthew 24 picks up at the last part of verse 29. Section 5b, which is in the second video in this 2-part set, explains the instructions and warnings that Jesus gave about what to expect at the time of the end. Section 6 is just a brief review of some sources of information if you'd like to investigate the claims of the Bab, the Baha'u'llah, and the Baha'i Faith further. This information is in both of the videos at the very end of each of the videos. Again, the second video in this 2-part set will cover the sections with the red box and the red bracket there at the end. And next we will start section 2 of this video with a review of some Bible terminology and background information that are essential to know to understand Matthew 24. Before we get into the meat of Matthew chapter 24, there are at least 4 things about Bible prophecy topics that need to be clarified. Section 2 is split up into 4 segments that you see listed here. First, past translations into English from the original languages of the books of the Bible. There were some errors in translation, such as in number 1 here, the end of the world found in several chapters of Matthew, including chapter 24, was never correctly translated until more recent times. Unfortunately, many well-known Bibles had it as end of the world, such as in the widely read King James Version of the Bible. Some explanatory information will be offered. And the next slide, actually. The second thing, a few comments about why I'm using the New International Version, the NIV version of the Bible, instead of the King James Version, often favored by those who favor the literal interpretation of Bible prophecies. Third, a brief comment on literal interpretation versus spiritual or symbolic interpretation of Bible prophecies and their methods of fulfillment. Fourth, I'll explain the meanings of some key words in Bible prophecy, such as stars, the sun, the moon, and a few others. I'll explain all these things in a bit more detail in this section too, but it shouldn't take very long and it's worth knowing. Note the paragraph numbers on the slide. On the right, you see a copy of the previous slide, which laid out the 4 parts of section 2. As we go through section 2, you will see headings in the slide title at the top that state the section number or the paragraph number. Here on this slide, section 2, then a dot, and then the paragraph number on this slide on the right that will be addressed. So we'll start with 2.1, that is an explanation about the old incorrect translation end of the world. Now 2.2, obviously, when you see it in the slide title, means that that slide will be an explanation of section 2, paragraph 2, about why I'm using the New International Version instead of the King James translation, etc., etc. Just a little housekeeping here so that you kind of understand our progress in going through section 2 here. Okay, note the 2.1 at the top of the slide, section 2, paragraph 1 on the end of the world. The original Greek text of the book of Matthew at the top has a phrase you will see here in a couple locations. I'll try to pronounce the transliteration of the original Greek. Syntelias tuieionos. The King James Version of the Bible had it translated into English as end of the world. But the correct English translation is end of the age. Almost all recent editions of the Bible, even the New King James Version, includes the corrected translation as end of the age. If the original writer of this chapter of Matthew had truly wanted to state end of the world, he probably would have used the Greek word cosmos instead of ionos. It is important to remember, as we go through the verses of Matthew 24, that when you see references to the end, it is speaking of the end of the age, not the end of the world. Jesus mentions at the beginning of Matthew that the signs he is giving will signal the end of the age. But remember too, when one age ends, another age begins. Jesus is speaking of the new age, the new era that the new Messiah will bring for humankind, the new world, so to speak, on earth as it is in heaven, the day that will not be followed by night. On to the second part of section 2, to address why I'm using the NIV and not the King James Version of the Bible, where the yellow arrow is pointing. Some fans of the King James Version of the Bible may take umbrage at the use of the New International Version instead. Note that the NIV is the second most widely used version of the English translation of the Bible. Also, I'm just using it here for Matthew 24. Except for the change of end of the world to the corrected end of the age, the NIV and the King James texts are very, very close together. The reasons why I'm using the NIV include the latest NIV has very up-to-date translation, including that end of the age correction. The King James Version uses Elizabethan English, sometimes not easily understood. Modern English translations eliminate that barrier. And there is nothing sacred about the King James Version. It was simply one of the first translations from the Greek into the Elizabethan English. And just an FYI here, the English language did not even exist when Jesus walked the earth, and for several hundred years thereafter. Why would a translation into a very early form of English take precedence over other versions that use more up-to-date understandings of what the original Greek text actually said? Some King James devotees tend to interpret Bible prophecies literally and have built their interpretations of them around the King James language, especially the end of the world mistranslation, even though that is a well established as not being the correct translation, as we discussed. Here are a few differences in terms between the NIV version and the King James Version. The NIV version of those few words or phrases are on the left, well, the middle column, and the King James is on the right. Now verse 3, and you'll see the verse numbers in the left column. Verse 3 is where the end of the age phrase is located, which is end of the world in the King James Version. Verse 12, the NIV text speaks of an increase in wickedness, whereas the King James states iniquity shall abound. Verses 21 and 29, instead of tribulation, is mentioned in the King James Version. It is referred to as distress in the NIV. The original Greek word is thlipsis. Note that the Messiah for this new era, Baha'u'llah, states that the best translation of this word, specifically in Matthew 24, is oppression. As he states, quote, the Greek word used, thlipsis, has two meanings, pressure and oppression, end quote. Further comments will be offered when we get to verses 21 and 29 later in this video. In verse 28, the NIV speaks of vultures, but the King James uses the word eagles. The NIV term vultures seems to give a truer sense that the bird is feeding off the dead carcasses mentioned in that verse. Again, experts in the Greek used around the time of Jesus in that part of the world now know more precisely what the best Greek to English translation should be. And verse 29, the NIV text uses the phrase heavenly bodies, whereas the King James uses powers of the heavens. Next, section 2, third paragraph. We'll briefly discuss the three different ways Bible prophecies can be fulfilled. That's literally, that is, material fulfillment in this earthly realm, or spiritually, meaning the words are used symbolically to represent spiritual events or conditions, or sometimes, but not always, both literally and spiritually. Section 2 and paragraph 4 we're addressing now, a heavenly dictionary of some key words where the yellow arrow is pointing. What do they mean when defined literally in the middle column and spiritually or symbolically in the right column, and the words themselves are in the left column? This is only a few terms here to give a taste of the expansiveness of the spiritual meanings of these terms. More terms will be addressed as we get into the actual prophecy explanation. Note that some of the symbolic meanings are from the Baha'i sacred writings, often from the pen of Baha'u'llah himself, who would know better the meanings of Bible prophecies than the Messiah himself. First, at the top, what is an earthquake? Literally, it's shaking of the ground, often with damage to buildings and sometimes, unfortunately, resulting in injuries and deaths. But what in the world would a symbolic earthquake be? Looking at the column top right, we see some ideas on how an earthquake occurring can be symbolic or spiritual in meaning. Some examples here: an earthquake in society, institutions, regimes, etc. means the power centers are shaken and weakened, and they become unstable. Other examples, quote, the earthquake of doubts, or shook the pillars of the world, meaning the foundations of a society are shaken and upset. Next term on the bottom there, heavenly bodies per the New International Version. Literally, that would mean our sun and moon, all the planets and their moons in our solar system, and all the constellations of other stars and their planets and moons. Then we'd have to figure in also things like comets, asteroids, and other objects in outer space. Some of these other objects can become meteors affecting our planet when they breach our atmosphere and gravity and fall towards Earth. Next, if you look in the bottom right there, the symbolic meaning of heavenly bodies would include the manifestations of God, also known as prophets, and that's with a capital P. I'll explain that in a minute. Also called divine luminaries and such. Also, heavenly bodies can be symbolic of humans who become leaders of religion but who are not divine prophets or manifestations of God. The context of the prophecy text may indicate which applies, whether it's a prophet of God or a human person in the high echelons of power. By the way, I always use a capital P when referring to prophets or manifestations of God, those who bring revelation from God and their own laws and sacred texts as the foundation of their faiths. Small p prophets would include the minor prophets, meaning Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the like. Next, the term sun, S-U-N. The literal meaning in the middle column is obvious, the fixed star which is the center of our solar system. The symbolic meanings of sun is in the right column. There are a couple. In some contexts of verses, it means a manifestation, also known as a prophet of God, those who bring a revelation from God. Here is a quote that gives an example of the spiritual expansiveness of a symbolic meaning to referring to something as a sun, S-U-N. This is a quote from Abdul-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah. This is about the Son of Truth, foretold in the New Testament as coming in the future, and whom Baha'u'llah fulfills. Quote, "It is a lovely day. The sun shines brightly upon the earth, giving light and warmth to all creatures. The Son of Truth is also shining, giving light and warmth to the souls of men. The sun is the life giver to the physical bodies of all creatures upon earth. Without its warmth their growth would be stunted, their development would be arrested, they would decay and die. Even so do the souls of men need the Sun of Truth to shed its rays upon their souls, to develop them, to educate and encourage them. As the sun is to the body of a man, so is the Sun of Truth to his soul." End quote. In another sense, sun can refer to the leaders of the religions of past dispensations. Sun can also mean the laws and teachings of those previous dispensations. However, when a new manifestation of God brightens the world with his revelation from God, those previous suns have set. Their spiritual light dims in comparison with the new revelation. To everything there is a season, if you recall. A star in our material universe is a fixed luminous object in our night sky, which is a huge, remote, incandescent body like our own sun, only most of those stars are the same size or larger than our sun. Moons are natural satellites of planets. Moons do not generate or give off light of their own, but rather only reflect light from other sources, the stars of our universe. The symbolic or spiritual meanings of stars and moons are the leaders of religions, not manifestations of God, but rather they are purely human people who gain leadership positions in the religious communities of humankind. In another sense, sun, stars, and moons can represent the laws and teachings of the previous dispensations when a new manifestation of God appears. These older laws and teachings can dim in influence in the world, meaning become darkened or lose their light after the new manifestation of God appears in the world and brings updated laws for us. Then we go to the term falling or fallen stars. If we are speaking of literal stars in the universe, such an occurrence cannot happen. Stars do not fall. If speaking of falling to Earth, to the surface of our planet, this is absolutely impossible. As one great Baha'i thinker put it, quote, "It would be as though 1,000 million of Himalaya mountains were to fall upon a grain of mustard seed." End quote. It's impossible. So this must mean, if it were to be fulfilled literally, that these stars must be meteors, asteroids, or comets, although they do not really meet the definition of a star since they do not give off their own light, but rather reflect light, or the light is reflected as they travel through our atmosphere. Just for your information, our sun is 109 times the size of Earth, and our sun is only an average-sized star. The largest known star in our universe is about 1,700 times larger than our sun. So much for such bodies to fall to our Earth, literally. But what about symbolic falling or fallen stars? What could that mean? The fall of religious leaders who, because they denied the revelation of Baha'u'llah, are losing their influence over mankind. That's per Baha'i author and historian Adib Taherzadeh. The Pharisees were fallen stars at the time of Jesus because they denied his being the Messiah. The priests of ancient Egypt who rejected Moses were fallen stars. The leaders of idolatrous religions in Arabia who rejected Muhammad and his teachings of one God were the fallen stars of the Muhammadan dispensation. Note that the spiritual and symbolic meanings of prophecies, or their spiritual fulfillment, are far more important, more deeply meaningful, and long-lasting in effect than mere literal fulfillment of prophecies. Also, you will encounter this term, manifestation of God, throughout this video. This term is used in reference to all of God's messengers, from Abraham, Krishna, Buddha, Moses, Zoroaster, Jesus, Muhammad, to the Bab and Baha'u'llah, the latest ones. They are manifestations of the attributes of God, but they are not incarnations of God. Incarnation means that God would descend from the spiritual realm to reside in a human body. That would be something on the order of saying that the entire Pacific Ocean was to be put into a teacup. Rather, these manifestations of God are perfect mirrors that reflect the spiritual power, majesty, omnipotence, knowledge, and all the attributes of God to us, God's creation. We see God reflected in them, and they speak for God on earth. Because we see the spiritual image of God in these manifestations, it is as if we are seeing God when we see them. As God promised Abraham, he will continue to send these manifestations of himself to us, his creation, forever, to guide us spiritually, because we need guidance. We have made it through sections 1 and 2. on to section 3, where you will learn about Bible time prophecies. And yes, we do know the year of the Messiah's return. The Bible just did not give the exact day or hour. As we investigate Matthew chapter 24, we must keep in mind the book of Daniel. Why? Because Daniel tells us when the Messiah would appear. Why the book of Daniel? Because Jesus specifically said so. Time prophecies help us locate the time frame to look for the signs that Jesus mentions in Matthew 24 that would precede the appearance of the Messiah. Or, in other words, why the year 1844 is the year of the appearance of the Messiah. Jesus said this in Matthew 24. That's why we are skipping ahead to verse 15 of Matthew 24. Quote, "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand." End quote. We know that Jesus was pointing us to the book of Daniel for answers. One of the questions that Daniel answers is when the abomination causing desolation would end, meaning when the Messiah would appear. The answer to that is the year 1844 AD, or Common Era, the end point of the 2300 days prophecy in chapter 8, verses 13, 14, and 17 of the book of Daniel. Here is the text of these 3 verses from Daniel chapter 8, quote, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled, the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people? He said to me, It will take 2300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." And on to 17, "As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man," he said to me, "understand that the vision concerns the time of the end." End quote. Note that this means this time prophecy of the future to Daniel is to occur in the time of the end, meaning the end of the age, also known as the last days or the latter days. For Bible time prophecies, the very first and fundamental term in math to learn is that a day in prophecy equals a year to us humans on earth. To reiterate, a day in Bible verses that are time prophecies means that the prophecy is actually meaning a year on earth. Hebrew and Christian scholars agree on this. The Bible references that explain this, a day for a year, are listed on the screen. Daniel speaks of 2300 evenings and mornings. An evening and a morning equals 1 day. Thus, 2300 evenings and mornings are 2300 days in prophecy. And in Bible prophecies, that means that 2300 days really is foretelling 2300 years on planet Earth. The meaning of the terms reconsecrating the sanctuary and cleansing of the sanctuary is the coming of the Anointed One, the Messiah. And the reestablishment of the sanctuary means that a new covenant from and with God will be established, thus making a clean slate for humanity by the coming of a new revelation from God. This timeline shows that 2300 day prophecy, meaning 2300 years, but we don't have a starting point yet on the left, so we don't yet know the end point on the right, meaning when the Messiah would appear. How do we find out when this 2300 year period begins and ends? The starting point for counting these 2300 days or years to the second advent is the same year as the starting point for the coming of the first advent, foretold in the book of Daniel, chapter 9. This was well documented in my video, Christ Has Returned, which is just a reflection of the studies of the prophecies by hundreds of Christians back in the early 1800s. That starting point is the year 457 BC. This is one of the many charts developed by the Seventh-day Adventists and others. This one shows the culmination of the 2300 days in the year 1844. There were numerous groups and individuals who became convinced of Christ's imminent return in the 1840s. Many also made charts similar to this one. When Christ did not come down out of the sky on a literal cloud and land at their feet, numerous people who were expectant of this and then greatly disappointed when it didn't happen, they then decided that Christ had returned, but only in heaven, not on earth, and they formed, some of these disappointed people, formed the Seventh-day Adventist sect of Christianity at that time. This is a diagram that I made for my video, Christ Has Returned, to illustrate the 2300-day prophecy endpoint in 1844. It is very similar to the one developed by the Seventh-day Adventists and others that showed the timeline for that 2300-year period. They both start at the left at 457 BC. The high, long blue arch is the 2300-year prophecy period of time. So both prophecies, the first and the second Advent prophecies, start at exactly the same beginning point, 457 BC. Now, the 70 weeks prophecy is actually in chapter 9 of the book of Daniel. Note that this 2300-year period ends in the year 1844, Common Era, again meaning that the Messiah would appear at that time, the year 1844. This is yet another one of the many charts that have been devised showing the long-known meaning of this prophecy, the 2300-day prophecy. Starting in the early 1800s, Christians the world over became energized by the discovery of the meaning of this 2300-day prophecy, and that it indicated the year 1844 was when Christ would return. Note that the purple arch on the left is the time period until the first advent of the Messiah, the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel chapter 9 that bore fruit when Jesus Christ walked the earth and taught his message of love and salvation. Now this timeline is a little different. It's showing 3 Bible time prophecies about when the Messiah would arrive, all foreseeing the year 1844 as the year. The green timeline at the bottom of the slide starts with 602 BC with the start of the prophecy in Daniel chapter 4 verse 25 about the length of King Nebuchadnezzar's punishment for being ungrateful to God. Note that the prophecy's hidden meaning is that this 7 times of punishment applies to humanity as a whole, not just punishment of this long-dead King Nebuchadnezzar. The next prophecy, the one called the 2300 days prophecy of Daniel chapter 8 verse 14, started the counting in year 457 BC and also ended in 1844, as we already discussed. The wide, shorter pink arrow shows the prophecy that is given in several Bible books and verses as 1260 days, it also a time, times, and half a time, and as 42 months. They all mean the same period of time, 1260 lunar years, starting in 622 Common Era from the Gregorian calendar, when Muhammad's faith, Islam, officially began with the beginning of the Islamic calendar and ending in, wouldn't you know, 1844 Common Era, the very year that the Bab made his proclamation as being a manifestation of God and that he was the forerunner of one even greater than he, who he called him whom God shall make manifest, meaning Baha'u'llah. 1844 was also the very beginnings of Jews returning to their land of Israel with an awakening goal of forming their own nation once again. In that year, the Ottoman government restrictions of non-Muslims ended by edict of the courts, and all non-Muslims began to have equality before the law and freedom to worship their own faiths, including Judaism. Remember my mentioning once or twice during this that I have a video called Christ Has Returned? Well, this is how you can access it on YouTube. It explains several of these Bible time prophecies foretelling the appearance of the Messiah in 1844, and it is a must-watch video. It is true that the Bible does not give the day or the hour of his appearance, but it does give the year of his coming in several locations that were already mentioned. So watch this video. Go to my YouTube channel named Integral Destiny 9 that you see there. Integral Destiny 9 with a number 9 at the end. All one word with no spaces in between. You can also access my YouTube channel now by just putting in your browser search box the URL that's given at the bottom there, www.youtube.com/c/ and then Integral Destiny 9, my channel number. And then you have to look for the video by this name because this address here just gives how to get to my channel. You'll see lots of other videos there too. Just remember this year, 1844. It's from the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. The meaning of these time prophecies leading to the year 1844 was discovered by Christian scholars and prophecy buffs in the early 1800s. Their only fault, albeit a major fault, was they expected Jesus to come down out of the sky and land at their feet. When he did not, they didn't go out scouring the planet to find him. They just gave up. What folly! And it is truly a sad case. But we know what happened in 1844, don't we? The Bab made his declaration in May of 1844 that he was the promised one and the herald of another greater than he who would soon appear, the Messiah of the latter days, the Lord of hosts, the returned Christ in the station of the Father. Baha'u'llah made his great announcement in 1863. So this is our time frame leading up to and around the 1840s for these signs that Jesus spoke about in Matthew 24 should start making their appearances. I am introducing this timeline here just to make you aware that you will be seeing this timeline with various additions to it as we go through chapter 24 of Matthew. Now we are back to the table of contents of this video to see where we are. Next is the read-through of the whole of Matthew chapter 24, all 51 verses, with no stopping for comments. It will take several minutes for me to read through it. Again, if you are familiar with it already, you can just kind of fast forward through it. Now I will, as quickly as I can, read the entirety of chapter 24. Note that it is all on 6 slides, with some of the text being very small. You may not be able to read along. Now, the NIV edition of the Bible starts with the heading, The Destruction of the Temple and Signs of the End Times. And remember, the end times is the end of the age, not of the world, as we previously discussed. Quote, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Messiah,' and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Messiah,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it, for false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, 'There he is out in the wilderness,' do not go out, or 'Here he is in the inner rooms.' Do not believe it, for as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. The day and hour unknown. But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a hand mill. One will be taken and the other left. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have left his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom the master has put in charge of the servants in this household, to give them their food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly, I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, "My master is staying away a long time," and he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's the end of chapter 24. Now just a few notes about Matthew chapter 24. You may have noticed that Matthew 24 is basically made up of 2 parts or functions. They are, first, verses that are prophetic of future events or conditions, signaling the coming of the Messiah, and verses that are instructions and or warnings to the followers of Jesus. First, I'll address the prophecies and how they were fulfilled. If you notice a verse or 2 are missing from a list that I have coming up that you can see, that will most likely mean that those verses were not prophecies, but rather instructions or warnings, which will be covered after we address the prophecy verses. Note that the explanation of the prophecies and how they were fulfilled is divided up, with a portion of it that are put into video number 2. That's part 2 of this 2-part video series on chapter 24. Thus, section 5b on the instructions and warnings that Jesus gave will be in part 2 of the series. So now we begin our intensive review of section 5a. That's the signs of the coming of the Messiah. I've broken down the prophecy statements from chapter 24 and put them in this table. It goes on for 3 slides, and I've numbered them from 1 through 21, the elements of the chapter 24, the elements of prophecy in chapter 24. So number 1 there is from verses 4 and 5, that many will come in the name of Jesus or Christ or Messiah and will deceive many. From verse 6, that's row number 2, you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars, but the end is yet to come. That's just a paraphrase so far. Prophecy 3, this is from verse 7. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Row 4, again that's from verse 7. Famines and earthquakes in various places. Row 5, from verse 8. All of the above are the beginning of birth pains. Row 6, from verse 9. You, meaning most likely the followers of Christ, will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. And element number 7, row 7, from verse 10. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray or hate one another. Element number 8 is from verse 11. Many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Row 9, from verse 12, there will be an increase in wickedness, causing the love of most will grow cold, apparently. Row 10, from verse 14, this is quote, "This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world," end quote. Then the end will come. Row 11 from verse 15. This is a quote. "When you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand," end quote. And then row 12, another quote from verse 21. "For then there will be great distress or oppression, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again," end quote. And there it also has verse 22. "If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened," end quote. And prophecy element 13 from verse 27. "For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man," end quote, meaning the Messiah. Prophecy element number 14 from verse 28. "Whenever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather." Number 15 from verse 29. "Immediately after the distress or oppression of those days, the sun will be darkened." Row 16 still from verse 29. "The moon will not give its light." Number 17, still from verse 29, "The stars will fall from the sky." Element 18, still from verse 29, "And the heavenly bodies will be shaken." Element number 19 from verse 30, "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven." Number 20 is from verse 30, "All the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." And element number 21 from verse 31, "And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heavens to the other." So there are 21 total prophecies, or what I called prophecy elements, in Matthew 24. That means 21 distinct foretelling of events or conditions that will occur in the future to Daniel. The future to Matthew. But you may notice one possible duplication of a prophecy. There were two prophecies of false prophets to come. But we must go back to the original texts of those two verses. Verse 5 warns, quote, "For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many," end quote. And verse 11 states, "And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people." The important distinction here in my mind is verse 5 states they would come in his name, Jesus, or maybe his divine title or name of Son of God, whereas verse 11 just mentions false prophets in general. I'm counting these two verses as two different prophecies, people claiming to be the returned Jesus, and others that don't claim they are Jesus or the Christ returned, but simply claim they were sent by God. I could be wrong. They may claim special divine knowledge from God and access to God, maybe including claims of knowing the future. We have to go back and begin at the beginning. What prompted Jesus to talk about the future? We go to the very beginning of chapter 24 to understand, and note the beginning of the chapter in the New International Version translation is titled "The Destruction of the Temple and Signs of the End Times." We begin with the first verse, quote, "Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. 'Do you see all these things?' Jesus asked. 'Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down.' As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. 'Tell us,' they said, 'when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" End quote. So the disciples wanted to know more about when the temple would be destroyed, and apparently Jesus had indicated that he would return in the future at some point. They wanted to know some specifics about that. And of course, note again that it's the end of the age that he's talking about, not the end of the world. It's interesting to note what the books of Mark, Luke, and John say about the temple being destroyed and Christ's return. These books of Mark and Luke do reflect the same discussion about the signs of Christ's return, but in different chapters. In Mark it's chapter 13 and Luke it's chapter 21. And note that the book of John does not mention this conversation that Jesus had with a few of his disciples. However, in chapter 2 of John, in a different scenario, a different scene, different players, John mentions that Jesus spoke of the destruction of the temple and it being rebuilt in 3 days. But John notes Jesus meant that the temple that would be rebuilt in 3 days was the body of Jesus, not the physical temple itself. And Mark is the only book that identifies the disciples who were asking this question of Jesus: Peter, James, John, and Andrew. Note that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not mentioned as being present at the time that Jesus was speaking about the future of the temple and other future events. John was mentioned, but it is not known for sure that the book of John was written by the Apostle John or some other John or someone else entirely. But this is all just a little FYI for you guys. Now we get to the answers that Jesus gave to the disciples, meaning the prophecies of the future leading up to the return of the Messiah to the world. The first response that Jesus gave was this in verses 4 and 5, quote, "Jesus answered, 'Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many.'" End quote. This response is not very specific as to time, place, or the effects of the appearance of many who would claim to be either Jesus and or claim the station of Messiah. What is the concern with false messiahs? It's not specified by Jesus, but we can surmise that such effects as listed here or others could occur. The introduction of false teachings into the faith could occur, or some believers splintering off to follow the false claimants, the creation of dissension into the community of the followers of Jesus, and the weakening of the faith. There have been countless numbers of people who have claimed to be the return or reincarnation of Jesus Christ in the flesh throughout the last 2,000 years. These claimants have come from all over the globe, including from Australia, Brazil, Russia, South Africa, Japan, England, and more. The world began seeing this phenomenon since shortly after Jesus was crucified. That includes some modern-day claimants, including at least one woman. So we know at the outset that anyone who claims they are Jesus, using that name of Jesus, or claiming they are the body of Jesus reincarnated or otherwise come to life, are automatically false. They cannot be the return of the Messiah. Why do we know that? Because Jesus himself stated that he would have a new name when he returned. Where did Jesus say that he'd have a new name when he returns? 2 verses in the book of Revelation that you see here, chapter 2, verse 17, and chapter 3, verse 12. The quote from chapter 2 is, quote, "Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious I will give some of the hidden manna. I will also give that person a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to the one who receives it." End quote. And from Revelation chapter 3, quote, The one who is victorious I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will they leave it. I will write on them the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from my God, and I will also write on them my new name." End quote. You can readily see that Christ, who is giving this vision to John of Patmos, who authored the book of Revelation, he is telling John that when he returns he will have a new name, and his followers will have new names too. That's what it means when he says, "I will also write on them my new name." In the book of John, chapter 14, verses 16 and 17, Jesus says the following, quote, "And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever, the Spirit of truth." End quote. And this in the book of John, chapter 16, verses 12 through 15, Jesus is speaking here about the future when the Spirit of truth comes. Quote, "I have much more to say to you, more than you can bear. But when he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all the truth. He will not speak on his own. He will speak only what he hears, and he will tell you what is yet to come. He will glorify me, because it is from me that he will receive what he will make known to you. All that belongs to the Father is mine. That is why I said the Spirit will receive from me what he will make known to you." End quote. Note that there are 11 he or his pronouns, meaning someone other than the speaker, who was Jesus Christ. So he referred 11 times to he, who would come after him, Jesus Christ. Obviously not to be Jesus, since he was referred to as he. There are 6 mentions of I, me, or mine in these verses. Obviously, Jesus was speaking of himself when he mentions I, me, or mine, and someone else when he stated he or his or him. Therefore, if someone claims to be Jesus himself, you know that he or she is not. But what about if someone claims he or she is the Messiah, not Jesus once again in the flesh? First, this is fundamentally different that someone claiming they are the reappearance or reincarnation of that human body named Jesus. The blood and flesh of Jesus were never of intrinsic spiritual value. It was the divine spirit associated with that physical garment that was the important spiritual element. Some of you are going to get a little irritated with me here. Just in case some of the viewers are unaware of a few simple facts of language, I feel the need to mention a few things. The word Christ derives from the Greek word Christos. Christos means anointed one. So when you say Jesus Christ, you are saying Jesus the anointed one. The English word Messiah comes from the Hebrew word for the anointed one, Mashiach. Therefore, Christ and Messiah mean the same thing, the anointed one. And to clarify, Christ was not Jesus' last name. It was his divine title. Perhaps more appropriately to mentioning Christ, you should say Christ Jesus rather than Jesus Christ. It is this divine being, Mashiach, Messiah, Christos, who would return, not the body of Jesus, but a spirit with a different human garment, meaning a different physical body, and a different human name. Just like when Jesus appeared to fulfill the prophecy by Moses that a prophet would arise someday from his Hebrew people. Moses himself did not return, but rather a new person with a new name appeared, named Jesus. So have there been those who claim to be the Messiah? Yep, there have been and are legions of people who have made such a claim before and since Jesus made his claims to Messiahship. Here are some of them. Some of the names may be familiar to you. These are not in any particular order, just a hodgepodge from a very cursory search on the web. You can probably find many more if you choose to search. And here are some additional people who claim to be the Messiah. Now, on some lists I saw, Jesus Christ was listed as a claimant to Messiahship, because of course that was true. He did claim it. And on some lists I have found the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Usually Baha'u'llah is listed as a claimant to the Jewish and/or Christian Messiah station. The Bab, if listed at all, tends to be on the list of those who claim to be the Mahdi, the Savior or Redeemer to Islam. The way I see it, there are at least 4 possibilities when someone claims to be the Messiah or a prophet of God on par with Jesus, Moses, etc. This person will meet at least 1, maybe up to 3 out of 4 of these 4 possibilities I'll review here. First, the person is a con artist who knowingly is falsely claiming to be the Messiah or prophet to acquire money, power, sex, and/or fame. He or she knows they are not really the divine entity they claim to be. Number 2, the person has been convinced by others to make such a claim and are fooled by those people into believing it's true. Otherwise, if he or she doesn't really believe it, he or she really falls under definition number 1 above. Third, the person is mentally ill and simply does not know reality from fantasy. He or she could think they are the Messiah or can be influenced or controlled by others who want to make use of this false claim. Elements of numbers 1 and/or 2 could also play a role here too. Or 4, he or she is truly the Messiah, the manifestation of God for this new era. This person, if truly a prophet or manifestation of God, will not meet any of the conditions 1 through 3 above. Christ warned about being deceived by false messiahs or prophets. But remember, he promised that he would return, that there would be a true prophet, not just false ones. And let's not forget, Jesus gave us a tool for discerning the false from the true prophet. It's in Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 to 20. And here is Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 to 20. And this is Jesus speaking here. Quote, "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit you will recognize them." End quote. So exactly what is the tool that Jesus gave us? It's Matthew chapter 7, verse 20. Quote, "Thus by their fruit you will recognize them." End quote. In the King James Version it reads, "By their fruit ye shall know them." That phrasing may sound a little more familiar to you. Did Jesus mean that we need to compare how good their apples and pears and strawberries are? This is one of the many instances where trying to understand everything in the Bible as having a literal meaning really leads you in a very wrong direction. This is a metaphor. Their fruits are their attributes. Do the claimed prophets have good attributes or bad? An attribute is a quality or characteristic of a person, thing, or group. One can have good attributes, also known as virtues, or bad attributes, also known as vices. Since we are trying to recognize the manifestation of God, the attributes we are going to compare are those of character and spirit. In other words, it won't matter if the person is rich or poor, educated in elite schools or of no significant schooling at all, praised by leaders in society or scorned by them, etc. Here is a list of some good attributes on the left, then the opposite, the bad, in the right column. Some examples: generous is a good attribute, and the bad would be someone who is stingy. Near the bottom of the list, truthful is good, dishonest or a liar is bad, etc. I think we can commonly agree on what is a good attribute and what is not, unless you are a sociopath, that is. For emphasis, let's review verses 17 and 18. Quote, "Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit." End quote. So when you are faced with deciding if someone who is claiming to be a prophet of God is a false prophet or a true prophet, Jesus promised that a good tree will bear good fruit, and a bad tree will bear bad fruit. And further, Jesus said that a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and that a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Jesus promised that you will be able to know and recognize false prophets, not that you would not be able to recognize them, as long as you use the tool that Jesus gave us. So do not be afraid to investigate such claims. You will have to work to discover the truth. It will take effort on your part to examine the claims, actions, activities, history, associates, etc. of the persons making a claim of being a prophet of God. Do not just accept the claims of the Bab or Baha'u'llah, or anyone else who claims a special relationship to or mission from God. Investigate and test. You will need to apply and utilize the scientific method. Do research. Let neither love nor hate cloud your judgment. If this presentation annoys you because it is very different from what you've been taught, set that annoyance aside and investigate. Likewise, if you just love everything you've heard, still investigate in a methodical way. Regarding the claims of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, or any other person claiming to be from God, read their writings, talk to the followers of their faith or group. Do not just rely on one person, book, internet site, or group of people for your information. Remember, the blind leading the blind, well, they both end up in the ditch. And take your time. That does not mean to procrastinate, however. Just do not rush. If you are worried about cults, keep this in mind. If anyone tries to control your activities or your contacts with your family or friends, run away. That is one sign of a cult. A false prophet can hide his bad fruit for only so long before the truth becomes apparent, if you maintain a scientific approach to your inquiry and are watchful. Note, information sources are at the end of this video so that you can start your investigating if you so choose. Now we are moving on to the prophecies in verses 6 through 8 in Matthew 24. Quote, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains." End quote. We're going to dissect these verses one by one. The verse, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come." Jesus, stating that there would be wars and rumors of wars, creates the scenario of a long period of time. He did not state battles and rumors of battles, as in a single war, but rather in terms of many wars. His mention that the end is still to come means the end of the age, of course, and it is not to occur even after these wars tells us that the end of the age will be a long time in coming after his time on earth. This illustration is from the website ourworldindata.org. That's all one word, no spaces, ourworldindata.org. The exact URL for this illustration is given at the top under the title Population Control Marauder Style, a rather tongue-in-cheek title that very correctly conveys the cause of these deaths, human violence against one another with many innocent collateral damage deaths. The data covers the years 400 BC through 2000 AD. The chart is divided into 6 segments or categories of the cause of the violence causing deaths. At the top are those caused by international wars. Below that, from institutional oppression, such as the slave trades in the world and the conquest of the Americas. Then there are deaths from failed states, then those from despots, such as Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Idi Amin. Then at the bottom, deaths from colonial wars and deaths from civil wars, which includes the American Civil War. You may find it interesting to explore this website. Next, I'm going to enlarge this area on the illustration where the red box is. It's about deaths caused by international wars. This is an enlargement from the previous slide's illustration of population control marauder style. It describes the number of deaths from international wars, including invasions such as Genghis Khan's marauding adventures, shall we say, throughout Asia and the Middle East. The red arrow is pointing to the representation of Genghis Khan's wars. Note that the tag there states number 2, Genghis Khan, with a number 40 in bold text after that. The number 2 preface means the number of deaths from Genghis Khan and his troops ranked number 2 out of the 100 ranked international wars that this illustration, the larger illustration, shows. The number 40 means that Khan's wars caused about 40 million deaths, second only to World War II, 7 centuries later. If you look at the large gray circle in the bottom right, that is the representation for World War II. It is ranked number 1 with the number of deaths being 66 million caused by World War II. Note at the top it shows the years 1000 AD or Common Era on the far left and the year 2000 on the right. It appears to me that although there have been some terrible wars causing millions of deaths from the year 1000 to about 1700, we humans really picked up steam after 1700 and started many more international wars with more frequency, including World War I and II. And of course, the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War and some others aren't even in this data. This is another representation of global deaths in conflicts since the year 1400 through the year 2000. Each circle or dot represents one conflict. The size of the circle represents the absolute number of fatalities, military and civilian. The position of the dot represents the fatality rate, that is the number of deaths per 100,000 people. The 2 larger dots in the upper right are World War I and World War II, obviously a large number of deaths by the size of the circles, and from their positions on the graph they caused a high death rate per 100,000 people. The limit of this data is that it only goes to the year 2000, as I mentioned before. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and some others are not included in the data. Just a cursory look at the graph, it's noticeable that since around the year 1800, the number of conflicts appears to increase, as well as the number of fatalities and the death rates from those events. Note that the red and blue lines on the right seem to dip, which is telling us that military deaths are trending down since World War II, perhaps partly due to better medical care for military casualties. Civilian deaths are included in the red line, which also show a decline in death rate for them too. The verse, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places." These are events the people of Jesus' time were familiar with. They were the major events of their lives. Jesus gave no indications of the length of time these would occur. Stating these generalities once again gives us an indication that it would be over a lengthy period of time that these would occur. It also diminishes the use of signs like war and famines to pinpoint when the age was ending. These, unfortunately, are not rare events. It's difficult to count something as a sign of the times if it's a common occurrence. This chart, from the same people at ourworlddata.org that gave us the other charts, gives the annual rate of famine deaths by decade starting in the 1860s through 2016. While we still do have famines in various parts of the globe, the rate of deaths has gone down since the 1960s. Just a little light in the darkness here, would that it would go down to zero. Unfortunately, apparently Afghanistan is in danger of famine right now. I show this because verse 7 of Matthew 24 mentions famine. Quote, "There will be famines and earthquakes in various places." End quote. Note that there was a huge number of deaths due to famine in the 1870s, shown on the left side of the chart. This was due to a global drought that lasted 3 years and resulted in famine in Asia, parts of Africa, India, and parts of South America. What about earthquakes? According to the National Earthquake Information Center, there are about 12,000 to 14,000 earthquakes a year around the world, or 35 a day. Throughout the world, in an average year, there's one great earthquake that's magnitude 8 or more, 18 major earthquakes, 7 to 7.9 in magnitude, 120 large earthquakes, magnitude 6 to 6.9, and 1,000 moderate earthquakes, 5 to 5.9. This map is from the U.S. Geological Survey Agency's National Earthquake Information Center for January 12, 2022, and it shows 48 earthquakes of 2.5 magnitude and larger throughout the world. There were 48 earthquakes, I guess I mentioned that, for this 24-hour period of time. I check this site frequently, not for Bible prophecy fulfillment clues at all, just a general interest in earthquakes. This map shows a fairly typical day. Some days are a bit better, meaning fewer quakes, some showing more, or some major earthquakes. The largest quake on this day was a 5.7 in New Zealand. What can we take from this information? There are a lot of quakes every day throughout the world. Thus, we probably should not consider literal earthquakes as a literal sign of spiritual events. The only qualifier, to my mind, is if a manifestation of God claims a specific literal earthquake was a special sign of something from a spiritual framework. What's it all about? Why am I showing this information about death from wars and violence that we visit upon each other? Because this data shows indicators of human suffering that Jesus mentioned in Matthew 24. Wars indicate heightened suffering, as are famines and earthquakes, happenings not unknown to the people in that part of the world that Jesus walked. The people could relate to those experiences described by Jesus. Death rates do not completely reflect suffering either. Living on when your loved ones have perished is suffering. Watching your children suffer from hunger, disease, and early death causes excruciating suffering. And the verse, all these are the beginning of birth pains. Study Bibles will tell you that when the various authors of the Bible made comparisons of levels of suffering being experienced, they often mention the pain a woman experiences when giving birth to a child. For example, Isaiah chapter 13, verse 8. So these wars and earthquakes would be just a beginning of the suffering humankind would endure until the time of the birth of the new age, with the coming of the new Messiah of the latter days at the end of Jesus' age. It is implied that when the new age arrives, even more suffering will occur. Jesus was emphasizing that these events will occur a long time in the future from his time. That in the meantime there will be wars, famines, earthquakes, and other such sorrow-causing events, that his followers must be steadfast during those times. And what would be their reward for their steadfastness and their faith? There would be a prize at the end of the age, and that would be the new Messiah and the establishment of a golden age on earth, wherein the meek would inherit the earth, and there would be a new heaven and a new earth. On to verses 9 and 10, quote, "Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other." End quote. And the phrase, "you will be hated," history shows the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy. From the time the Romans persecuted Christians in the earliest times, especially after the fire that destroyed 70% of Rome in 64 AD, for which Christians were a scapegoat. Then for several centuries until the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian. Then as Christianity spread into pagan Europe to those areas under less control of Rome, the new Christian converts would suffer persecution from followers of pagan traditional religious practices. And that phrase, "many will turn away," as the Christian church developed, more and more divisions in it developed too, as people disagreed with aspects of their original church teachings. This led to more and more denominations. Currently, I've read that there's as many as 38,000 sects of Christianity. As problems and divisions arise, many Christians have fallen away from organized Christianity, others changed religions entirely, and many have chosen atheism. This chart is from an article in Wikipedia about the dividing of the Christian church into thousands of sects in its 2,000-year history. Now I'm talking about the dividing of Christianity in sects because Matthew 24 is talking to his peeps, to his followers. So that's why I'm talking about Christianity. You can see the earliest schism was in the 5th century when the Assyrian church separated from the main church. Then in the 11th century, the division into the Roman and Eastern churches occurred. Then the Reformation in the 16th century resulted in other major divisions from the Roman Church, and religious violence and many wars. Then there's the clause, "will betray and hate each other." In the process of all these persecutions and divisions occurring, the weakness of spirit in some resulted in betrayal of some Christians by others, perhaps to save their own lives or curry favors from the persecutors. Then there were other episodes, such as the Inquisitions, wherein one group of Christians would judge the purity of others, often resulting in torture and death of those deemed heretical or accused of witchcraft or sorcery. The Inquisitions within the Roman Catholic Church started around the century the 1200s and lasted until the year 1860. Now, various tribunals were set up in certain countries, and that's why you end up with something called the Spanish Inquisition and the Portuguese Inquisition. But also there are some tribunals set up in certain cities or localities. But it was surprising to me to learn that this practice did not end until the year 1860. I thought it had ended much sooner than that. Note that this ending of the Inquisitions occurred after the proclamation of the Bab in 1844, and just a few years before the proclamation of Baha'u'llah in 1863. Division and hatred found productive soil in Europe, illustrated by the religious wars in Europe from 1517 to 1648. The Protestant Reformation resulted in about 150 years of conflict in Europe. The year 1517 was the year that Martin Luther began his attacks on some practices in the Catholic faith. The export of Christian sectarian problems to other nations, such as to the American colonies, was in that mix. For example, the Pilgrims went to the American wilderness because they wanted religious freedom from persecution in Europe, and, oddly enough, the freedom to persecute others for their religious beliefs. Northern Ireland's Catholics versus Protestants, that was a combination religious and political civil war, among others, even to this day. It's undeniable that Christianity had become divided and almost schizophrenic in its intersectarian relationships. These divisions continue to this day, especially as Christianity and some other faiths have become deeply involved in partisan politics and struggle for power in various countries. But there is hope. In the last few decades, there has been some growth in acceptance, not just between the sects of Christianity, but also with other religions. Interfaith efforts have taken root, although the loud rantings of the haters seem to be very vocal these days. We might ask, what is the future of intra- and inter-religious efforts? Baha'u'llah has instructed the peoples of the world to recognize their oneness and work with love and harmony to unify humankind. I'm going to read to you one of the revealed prayers in the Baha'i faith with a call for the unity of humankind. Quote, "O thou kind Lord, thou hast created all humanity from the same stock. Thou hast decreed that all shall belong to the same household. In thy holy presence they are all thy servants, and all mankind are sheltered beneath thy tabernacle. All have gathered together at thy table of bounty. All are illumined through the light of thy providence. O God, thou art kind to all. Thou hast provided for all, dost shelter all, conferrest life upon all. Thou hast endowed each and all with talents and faculties, and all are submerged in the ocean of thy mercy. O thou kind Lord, unite all. Let the religions agree and make the nations one, so that they may see each other as one family, and the whole earth as one home. May they all live together in perfect harmony. O God, raise aloft the banner of the oneness of mankind. O God, establish the most great peace. Cement thou, O God, the hearts together. O thou kind Father, God, gladden our hearts through the fragrance of thy love. Brighten our eyes through the light of thy guidance. Delight our ears with the melody of thy word, and shelter us all in the stronghold of thy providence. Thou art the mighty and powerful. Thou art the forgiving, and thou art the one who overlooketh the shortcomings of all mankind." End quote. And that prayer was written by Abdu'l-Baha, who was the son of Baha'u'llah and had a very special station in the Baha'i faith. Now, the Bab and Baha'u'llah brought a message for humankind that now is the time for us to realize our unity and to act on that knowledge with one another. Their instructions to us about the supposed differences that we have chosen in the past to divide us, race, gender, religion, nationality, must not persist any longer. We've made it through the verse 10 prophecy, that's number 7 at the bottom here. These verses have been fulfilled, although some are not very specific. For instance, verse 6, that's row 2, speaks about wars and rumors of wars in the nebulous future. As I've shown, there have been hundreds of wars up to this day, but using any one of them as a special sign of the coming of the Messiah is problematic. I think that's what Jesus was telling us when he said wars and rumors of wars, that life until the end of the age and the return of the Messiah would be full of wars, not to expect world peace until the new age in effect. Moving on to the prophecies in verses 12 and 13, quote, "Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved." End quote. Now the phrase "increase of wickedness" needs to be explained to keep us from confusing the meaning and intent of the word wickedness. Note that the King James Version translates it as "iniquity shall abound" instead of "increase of wickedness." Iniquity means gross injustice or wickedness and a violation of a right or duty, wicked act, or sin. Some synonyms of iniquity are evildoing, infamy, depravity. We must look to the version of this event and conversation between Jesus and the disciples in the book of Mark to understand what is meant as wickedness or iniquity shall abound. To do that, we will review the book of Mark, chapter 13, verses 9 through 13. Quote, "You must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me," meaning Jesus, "you will stand before governor and kings as witnesses to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all nations. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what to say. Just say whatever is given you at that time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. All men will hate you because of me, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved." End quote. There definitely was an increase in wickedness. Iniquity did abound, as reflected in the divisions within Christianity, causing much hatred, suspicion, and injustices within it. Jesus preached love and brotherhood. Thus, any behavior other than that could only be thought of as wickedness. So the wickedness increasing is referring to Christians suffering from persecution, the divisions that would happen within families, wars between the sects of Christianity, events within Christian communities such as the Inquisitions that we previously mentioned that would cause dissension and disunity within those Christian communities. And remember another verse wherein Jesus states that he will not bring peace to the earth, but rather division, and that is in Luke chapter 12, verses 51 and 52. Quote, "Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division. From now on there will be 5 in one family divided against each other, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. End quote. So these violent or disunifying divisions that Jesus foretold in those listed books, chapters, and verses will cause the love of most to grow cold. There's that phrase again, "to the end," in the blue box there. which means standing firm until the end of the age. Another call from Jesus to remain steadfast in faith through all of this. As to the foretelling that, quote, the love of most shall grow cold, end quote, these divisions, wars, and conflicts did affect how people within and without Christianity viewed the theology that caused or resulted from it. In our times, it has been noted by researchers that there are more and more nuns, N-O-N-E-S, nuns, in the USA at least. Nuns are people who state they are not a member of any organized religion, meaning that when polling is done on religious background, the respondents check off the none box. Nuns can include atheists as well as people who, although they believe in God and perhaps certain prophets, they are not a member of any faith community. This is a graph of data compiled by the Pew Research Center as of the year 2021 that shows that as of 2021, people who self-identify as Christian are 63% of the U.S. population, down from 78% in the year 2007. Those who self-identity as nuns are up to 29% of the U.S. population in 2021, up from 16% in 2007. Obviously, the increase in nuns in the USA shows a love of Christianity has cooled from 2007 to 2021. I've seen data for religiosity, per se, in general, in the world having decreased too. And note that at the very bottom it shows other religions, and the percent of other religions has barely budged, so it is not responsible for the increase in the nuns. Therefore, the verse 12 prophecy of an increase in wickedness is fulfilled. However, verse 13, saying that if you stay firm to the end, you could be saved, well, hopefully you will recognize the returned Messiah, but only the Messiah or God knows for sure if you will be considered saved. Onward to verse 14, quote, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come, end quote. Gospel, of course, means good news, the teachings of Jesus the Christ. And remember, the end is the end of the age, not the end of the world. A sign that the Messiah will soon appear would be when this gospel will be preached in the whole world. Immediately after the crucifixion of Christ, many Christians embarked on teaching efforts to spread the good news. On this map you can see the spread of Christianity through the year 600 Common Era. The dark orange areas were mostly Christian by the year 325, and the medium orange shows the spread by the year 600. Note that the areas in the Middle East and North Africa after the year 635 or so began to become mostly Muslim as Islam spread throughout those areas. But Christianity was still being spread throughout Europe and Russia, then to the Americas. Ultimately, these efforts would spread the message all over the globe. So when was the quest to teach the gospel throughout the world actually completed? William Sears, in his book Thief in the Night, The Case of the Missing Millennium, has a description of the efforts to spread the gospel throughout the world. The descriptions of this evidence are on the following slides. This is an excerpt from that book, a quote within a quote from the book, and it's actually from the Yearbook and Guide to East Africa by Robert Hale, published in 1953. Quote, a study of the spread of Christianity made by scholars of the 1840s convinced them that the message of Christ had, by their day, already encircled the globe. The gospel was being taught in all the continents. By 1844, it was being taught even in the interior of Africa, not by solitary missionaries, but on an organized scale. A commercial history of East Africa states Christian missions began their activities amongst the African people in 1844. End quote. And William Sears points out that the British and Foreign Bible Society was organized in 1804, and the American Bible Society was formed in 1816. The purpose of both these groups was to spread the gospel throughout the world. Many Bible prophecy enthusiasts at the time believed that the formation of these organizations was, in itself, a fulfillment of the prophecy. And from William Sears' book again, this quote, George Storrs, who was a 19th century Adventist movement leader, in the newspaper Midnight Cry on May 4, 1843, stated that these two societies, the British and American Bible Societies, with their innumerable branches, were spreading the gospel of Christ in every part of the world. Another finding regarding dates by William Sears on page 10 of his book, Thief in the Night, quote, in our day in the light of prophecy, W.A. Spicer, who was a well-known Seventh-day Adventist minister and a Bible prophecy scholar of the late 1800s and early 1900s, wrote that the gospel in his day had been spread to 95% of the inhabitants of the earth. He, Spicer, added, it was in 1842 that 5 treaty ports in China were opened to commerce and to missions, advanced steps in the opening of all China to the gospel. In 1844, Turkey was prevailed upon to recognize the right of the Muslims to become Christians, reversing Muslim tradition. In 1844, Allen Gardiner established the South American Mission. In 1842, Livingstone's determination was formed to open the African interior. End quote. There was a lot going on in the 1840s regarding the spread of the gospel. And note, Jesus said the gospel would be taught to the multitudes. He did not say that all that heard it would become Christians. We must go back to verse 14, quote, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now we know that the preaching of the gospel throughout the world will happen before the end of the age. The verse says so right here. Then the end of the age will come, and of course the Messiah would come. Well, we have our timeline here, and we're going to add some things to it, and note that it's really not to scale. First, we have the vertical blue line labeled 1844, showing the year that the book of Daniel and a few others give as when the Messiah would appear. That is the year the Bab declared that he was the promised one of Islam and he was the herald of the Messiah for the Christians and Jews, and all the religions on earth actually, and he would soon appear. On the far left you see, above the orange timeline, the markers for when the British and Foreign Bible Society and the American Bible Society were established in the years 1804 and 1816 respectively. Now you see added the markers showing when Baha'u'llah and the Bab were born in 1819 and 1817 respectively. That's in the bottom left. Now I've inserted the dates 1842, 43, and 44 for when the 5 treaty ports in China were opened to commerce and to missions, advanced steps in the opening of all China to the gospel, and Livingstone determined to spread the gospel in the interior of Africa in 1843 was 1843 was when George Storrs published his article declaring that the American and British Bible Societies had preached the gospel of Jesus Christ in all parts of the world by then. In 1844, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, recognized the right of Muslims to become Christians, reversing Muslim tradition. And Turkey issued the Edict of Toleration that allowed the Jews to return to the Holy Land with legal rights. In 1844, Allen Gardner established the South American Mission. It's a very visual illustration of how the gospel was preached in the world, and the Bab made his declaration of his identity in May of 1844, which was also the closure of the former Adamic cycle, or age, and the beginning of a new age. Then, in 1863, Baha'u'llah made his great announcement that he was the Messiah to the Jews and Christians, as well as the promised one of all the major faiths in the world. So the evidence shows that the gospel of Christ was preached throughout the world to the multitudes by 1844. Therefore, this prophecy in verse 14 is fulfilled by the time that the Bab made his stupendous announcement in that year. Onward to verse 15, quote, "So when you see, standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand." End quote. First thing we have to do is define, what does abomination that causes desolation mean? What did Daniel say about it? Michael Sowers, in his book The Prophecies of Jesus, explains, quote, "An abomination is something that causes loathing, abhorrence, or disgust, a sacrilege, meaning violation or transgression of what is sacred. Thus the prophecy in Matthew concerns something negative that will cause or bring desolation to the holy place. The holy place is generally understood to mean literally the Temple of Jerusalem, particularly its altar in the Holy of Holies." Verse 15 of Matthew chapter 24 resonates with this prophecy in Daniel chapter 11 verse 31, quote, "His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation." End quote. The phrase, "they will set up the abomination that causes desolation," meaning they will start the desolation by eventually abolishing the daily sacrifice at the temple site. The army that is conquering Jerusalem is not of the religion of the people they conquered in Jerusalem, and this army will interfere with their worshiping the religion of the people they conquer. In this prophecy of Daniel of the end times, meaning in the latter days, at the end of the age. Let's look at the book of Luke's version of this prophecy of Jesus for something said by Jesus that was in Luke, but not in chapter 24 of Matthew. So we look at Luke chapter 21 verse 20, quote, "When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near." End quote. Jerusalem at that time, in the latter days when the Messiah will return, according to Luke, will be a possession of Christians. Christians will have control of Jerusalem at the time that Jesus is speaking of it in the future. We know this because the verse speaks of seeing Jerusalem surrounded by armies. So it will be Christians looking out and seeing armies surround their city of Jerusalem. Jesus is speaking of the future of his faith and followers, not of the Jews who have rejected their Messiah foretold in Daniel chapter 9. If we look at the Holy Land in the years 636 and 637 Common Era, the Byzantine Empire, which was a Christian empire, was in control of Jerusalem. The Sunni Muslim armies surrounded and captured Jerusalem in that period of time, 636 and 637 Common Era. Here's a list of some of the conquerors of Jerusalem and Judea or Palestine since the time of Jesus. The yellow highlighted entry showing the first Muslim conquering of Jerusalem in the years 636 to 637 is shown. That's highlighted in yellow again. They kept control of Jerusalem for 462 consecutive years, then lost control for about 88 years to the Christians during the Crusades, controlled it again for about 113 years, lost it again for about 77 years, then the Muslim forces won it back in the year 1377 for another 541 years. After World War I, it became a British protectorate until it became the nation of Israel in 1948. Our foretold scenario of Christians looking out from Jerusalem and being surrounded by an army, that was fulfilled in those years 636 and 637, when the Christian Byzantine Empire at Jerusalem was defeated by Sunni Muslim forces. But we have to go back to the original verse here to remind ourselves what this is about in verse 15, which is the abomination that causes desolation. In particular, what was the abomination that causes desolation? The important thing about this period, when Jerusalem was surrounded by armies, Muslim troops, in the 636 Common Era time period, is that it was in this period of time that the leadership of Islam was desolated and desecrated shortly after Muhammad's death in 632 Common Era by the decision makers around Muhammad not following Muhammad's instructions as to who was to take over leadership of the faith upon his death. Muhammad had made it known that he wanted Ali, his cousin, to be the leader, and Ali's male descendants to be the leaders thereafter. Instead, after Muhammad's death, a small group of his followers elected Abu Bakr as the first caliph. And caliph means successor, by the way. After Abu Bakr's death in 634 Common Era, Umar became caliph. In the year 661, the Umayyad clan took over the leadership of Sunni Islam and reigned for 150 years, during which time its leadership was corrupted, thus devastating the leadership of Islam. This failure to follow Muhammad's divine decree resulted in spiritual harm to Islam that was the abomination that causes desolation. Now, the Shia branch of Islam did follow Muhammad's instructions by being headed by a descendant of Ali. Well, first Ali was the first Imam, and then his descendants thereafter. These leaders were called Imams. However, the 11th Imam died, possibly murdered, in the year 874 Common Era, and the 12th Imam was either killed or otherwise unable to fulfill the duties of the Imam position. Thus, Muhammad's prescribed leadership of the Shia branch of Islam ended in the year 874 Common Era. Islam? You may wonder how Islam entered into this discussion of abomination that causes desolation. This army was commanded by the leadership of the new Islamic faith. These leaders had desolated Islam, not Christianity or Judaism. The abomination that causes desolation is what happened to Islam because of the destructive usurpation of the true successorship of the leadership of Islam that Muhammad had wanted by those who were duplicitous, murderous plotters, especially someone named Abu Sufyan and his son Muawiyah. To clarify, Muhammad was a true prophet of God, but certain people around him were power-hungry, murderous thugs, especially Abu Sufyan and his son Muawiyah. They were of the Umayyad clan. I did mention them before as having taken over the leadership of Sunni Islam for about 150 years, gave them a lot of time to do their dirty work there to the leadership of Islam. The Umayyads subverted the leadership of Islam, as I'll describe in the next few slides. I realize this may be confusing to some of the viewers here. The full explanation is in my video titled Revelation Revealed that you see shown here. It is an explanation of the meaning of the book of Revelation, and Revelation prophecies the appearance of the Islamic dispensation. Note that Muhammad was prophesied in the book of Revelation, but he was not the prophesied return of the Messiah as either the Lamb or the one who sits on the throne in that book. Muhammad was prophesied to come between the revelation of Jesus and the appearance of the Lamb, who was the Bab. So if you'd like to see that video, Revelation Revealed, go to youtube.com, then into the search box on the site, just enter Integral Destiny 9, as you see there on the bottom of the slide. Don't forget the number 9 at the end. That's my YouTube channel name, Integral Destiny 9. It's spelled out there just below the video title. If you really don't want to watch the entire video, at least watch the parts about chapters 11 and 12 and a bit of maybe 13. See the video description for the time markers of certain sections of that video. Please note, and these are very important notes, Islam is a true religion of God, sent to the Arabic peoples through Muhammad to fulfill God's promise to Abraham in the book of Genesis, chapter 17, verse 20, that his descendants through Ishmael, the Arabic people, would be a great nation someday. A genuine true follower of the spirit of the Quran, their holy book, is as favored by God as much as any good Jew, Christian, or Baha'i, or Buddhist, or Hindu, etc. It was the leadership of Islam that was fouled, not the Quran itself or the individual believer, as long as he or she is true to the spiritual intent of the teachings, meaning peace and submission to the will of God. So, back to the book of Matthew. This all means that Matthew chapter 24 verse 15 is prophesying what happened to Islam, that is, that the leadership succession that the Prophet Muhammad had wanted was not followed in Sunni Islam, thus negatively affecting the leadership of Islam. Then Jesus goes on to tell of his return thereafter, after the holy place was occupied by non-Christians and non-Jews. After all that detailed explanation of what the abomination that causes desolation is, we continue on with the explanation of this verse 15, where we started before. Quote, "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand." By mentioning that phrase spoken of through Daniel, Jesus is directing us back to the book of Daniel to understand when the end of the age is and when his return would occur. That brings us to the big question: where in Daniel? In Daniel, there are two sets of prophecies about desolation. The column on the left lists the references to the topics that are in the Daniel chapter 9 prophecy of the first coming of the Messiah, Jesus the Christ. The column on the right lists the references to the same topics in Daniel chapter 8. The chapter 8 verses prophesy the second advent of the Messiah, who we know is Baha'u'llah, the glory of God, also known as the Lord of Hosts, or the one who sits on the throne, as he is termed in the book of Revelation. Since Jesus is speaking of the future in Matthew 24 about when he returns in the second advent, obviously he must be referring to chapter 8 of Daniel, That's in the column on the right, the green area. Look at row number 3 in the second Advent column. The desolation mentioned in chapter 9 concerning the dispensation of Jesus in the first Advent, right next to it to the left, speaks of the setting up or beginning of the desolation as a result of Jesus' dispensation. The desolation mentioned in chapter 8 concerns the end of the desolation with the appearance of the second Messiah. The source of this information in this format is from page 430 in the book titled I Shall Come Again by Dr. Hushadar Matla. That information is at the bottom of the slide. So let's examine verses 13 and 14 from chapter 8 of Daniel. Quote, "Then I heard a Holy One speaking, and another Holy One said to him, How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people. He said to me, It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." End quote. The term evenings and mornings equals 1 day in prophecy. Therefore, 2,300 evenings and mornings equal 2,300 days in prophecy. Jewish and Christian Bible scholars agree that in Bible prophecy a day equals a year. To repeat for emphasis, 1 day in prophecy equals 1 year in earthly reality. The origins of this Bible prophecy concept are these 3 verses in the Old Testament. But we know all about this already. Remember section 3 of this video, when we found out that the end of the age is in 1844? Again, that was in part 3 of this video. You might want to go back to view it if you don't remember that part. So, to fulfill Matthew 24 verse 15, the abomination that causes desolation has to end. The question is then, did it end? Yes, in 2 separate ways in 1844. The Sultan of Turkey, under pressure from Britain and France, issued the Edict of Toleration on March 21, 1844, that allowed Jews for the first time in centuries to live and have legal status in Palestine, the return of the Jews to their ancient land as prophesied in the Bible. And on May 23, 1844, the Bab revealed for the first time to his first disciple that he was the promised one of Islam and Christianity, the Mahdi to Islam and the Lamb of the Book of Revelation in Christianity, respectively. Thus the new dispensation of the new Messiah began. The appearance of a new manifestation of God ended the former age and opened the door, or the gate, to the next age of God. The signing of the Edict of Toleration on March 21, 1844, was exactly 2,300 years after Daniel had his vision on the first day of the Jewish month of Nisan. March 21 was the first day of Nisan 2,300 years later. The coming of a new manifestation of God, the Bab or the gate, the forerunner of the returned Messiah, was the reconsecration of the sanctuary mentioned in Daniel chapter 8 verses 13 and 14. Quote, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." You may recall this slide from the first section of the video. Note in the upper right part of the table, 1844 is shown to be the year of the proclamation of the Bab as the forerunner of the coming Messiah, Baha'u'llah, the glory of God. The end of the abomination that causes desolation in 1844, in complete agreement with the prophecies in Daniel, the book of Revelation and others, has occurred. It also signals the end of the age with the appearance of the Elijah figure, the Bob, of the new dispensation. Therefore, this prophecy in verse 15 is fulfilled. Just an FYI here, verses 16 through 20 inclusive will be explained when we get to section 5b, which is actually in the second video of this two-part video set. It will be in, if you recall, 5b is where it is explained the instructions and warnings about these future events that Jesus Christ reveals in chapter 24. So on to verses 21 and 22. Verses 21 and 22, quote, "For then there will be great distress, oppression, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened." End quote. Note the word distress is translated as tribulation in the King James Version and some other translations. However, the most appropriate translation of the word thlipsis in the original Greek text of the Bible is oppression, as we will shortly explain further. The language of the Bible is highly symbolic. Remember how much Jesus used parables to teach spiritual truths? Now these words in these verses we just reviewed, describing threats and desolation to one's material life, but the descriptions are actually metaphors for the spiritual desolation and plagues that humanity will face in the years after Jesus walked the earth, including for a time after the end of the age that Jesus was talking about, the end of that age. The word thlipsis, as you see written in Greek there in the top line in pink Greek letters, in the original Greek text of the Bible, according to Strong's Greek lexicon reference source, number G2346 that you see there, thlipsis can be translated into English as pressure, literally or figuratively. Also afflicted or affliction, anguish, burdened persecution, tribulation, or trouble. But according to Baha'u'llah, the Messiah for our new era, thlipsis is more appropriately translated as oppression, rather than either the word distress found in the New International Version of the Bible, or the word tribulation found in the King James Version. Thus, the time of the end of the age would be a time of spiritual confusion and destruction. What is the spiritual significance of the word oppression as opposed to tribulation or distress? Baha'u'llah, the new Messiah, reveals the following about the intent and the intensity of the word oppression of the time Jesus spoke of. Quote, "The oppression of those days," that's the quote from the Bible, "they refer to the time when men shall become oppressed and afflicted, the time when the lingering traces of the Sun of Truth and the fruit of the tree of knowledge and wisdom will have vanished from the midst of men, when the reins of mankind will have fallen into the grasp of the foolish and ignorant, when the portals of divine unity and understanding, the essential and highest purpose in creation, will have been closed, when certain knowledge will have given way to idle fancy, and corruption will have usurped the station of righteousness. Such a condition as this is witnessed in this day, when the reins of every community have fallen into the grasp of foolish leaders, who lead after their own whims and desires. On their tongue the mention of God hath become an empty name, in their midst his holy word a dead letter. What oppression is greater than that which hath been recounted? What oppression is more grievous than that a soul seeking the truth, and wishing to attain unto the knowledge of God, should know not where to go for it, and from whom to seek it." End quote. That's again from the pen of Baha'u'llah, written in the 1800s. Here is a summary of the 7 key points that Baha'u'llah made in that quote I just read. Manifestations of God are sent to humanity in places and times when we humans most need their fresh divine guidance. The Bab and Baha'u'llah appeared in Persia at the time that their society was in the midst of spiritual and societal illness. But it wasn't just Persia suffering from these problems. Baha'u'llah was sent for the spiritual edification of all humanity. Jesus said the new Messiah would come for the nations, plural. These problems permeated all societies on the planet. And remember, Jesus is saying in chapter 24 that the oppression would occur at the end, meaning the end of the age when the new Messiah would appear. And that would be around 1844, the times just before, during, and for a time after the appearance of the new Messiah. Number 1 and 2 on the list: the oppression and affliction caused by the lingering traces of wisdom will have vanished, and the reins of mankind will have fallen into the grasp of the foolish and ignorant. Were very much in evidence in Persia when the Bab and Baha'u'llah appeared there. The Shah, when the Bab made his proclamation, was not very bright and was tragically influenced by his corrupt Grand Vizier. The clergy were very powerful and not open to a legitimate consideration of the claims of the Bab and Baha'u'llah because it threatened their power and influence. The government was corrupt. Nothing got done unless money was paid to corrupt officials. The government was an authoritarian monarchy, and violence was a chief weapon of control. A counterproductive element of this monarchy was that those considered nobles and royals were not expected to be educated other than in horsemanship and court intrigue. So, as these elements of Baha'u'llah's explanation of oppression state, ignorant, corrupt leadership made for foolish leadership. Remember, the stated reigns of mankind in number 2 means the leadership of mankind, religious, political, media, educational, etc. Current conditions: as I write this narrative, as it was in Persia in the 1800s, the leadership of almost all nations suffers from the same lack of wisdom, also known as foolishness. So these conditions were present at the time the Bab and Baha'u'llah appeared, and since. We check off these prophecies by both Jesus and Baha'u'llah as fulfilled. Number 3, the portals of divine unity and understanding will have been closed. Have they? Religious intolerance was a fact of life in Persia in the 1800s. Even though Islam teaches Muslims must be open-handed and tolerant of people of the book, meaning Jews and Christians, Persia, modern-day Iran, was and still is intolerant of all other faiths and even other sects of Islam. Their persecution of Baha'is is an affront to the ideals of human rights and justice. Iran is primarily of the Shia sect of Islam, and its government is controlled by its clergy. Nowadays, the world seems to be increasingly fracturing along religious lines in many ways, although there has been some strong efforts through interfaith groups to bring the followers of all religions together. Some areas of the world are making good progress to establish recognition and safety to adherents of all faiths. In some others, unfortunately, more fanatical sects of some faiths are driving wedges between God's children. So we check this one off as having come true. Number 4, certain knowledge will have given way to idle fancy. At the time the Bab and Baha'u'llah appeared in Persia, they met with a civilization on the downturn. Knowledge of science was not encouraged or respected. Education was minimal, with nearly no public schools for the masses. Often education consisted solely of the study of the Quran. That may have been a good thing, but it left out a lot of subjects and students who could have contributed more to make a vibrant community if they had been schooled in additional subjects, or schooled at all. What about the present-day circumstances? Europe and North America has prided themselves in the last 80 years or so on the increase in accessibility to education being the bedrock of their prosperous economies and material conditions, yet increasing pressure from some factions express a desire to curtail this access to education, often in the name of self-reliance. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps on your own and such. Also, certain subjects, even if the truth, are being pushed out of the curriculums. What is more of an idle fancy than failure to teach the truth, or even to teach outright lies? So we're checking this one off as having come to pass also. Number 5, corruption will have usurped the station of righteousness. Being in a state of righteousness is highly prized in the teachings of Jesus Christ and other prophets of God. Around 1844, for people in a large part of the Christian West, chattel slavery was accepted, even considered biblical, because of its use as an economic mainstay of the empowered class. Money and the love of it corrupted the leadership of some powerful nations, the USA being the most reliant on slavery until 1865. The United Kingdom prohibited the buying and selling of slaves in 1807, but did not prohibit the owning of slaves in the United Kingdom nations until 1833. Present-day conditions have improved somewhat, but there is a broad, tacit acceptance of the practice in some countries of slave labor conditions, such as how China has treated the Uyghurs and Myanmar's treatment of the Rohingya. All for the love of money. Their slave labor makes the leaders of these countries wealthier, and the business owners all over the world who get their goods at a lower cost wealthier too. There are so many examples these days of how righteous actions are no longer the objective of life, but rather the acquiring of wealth, power, and ego enhancement are, meaning the corruptions of morals. Checking this one off too. Number 6, the reins of every community have fallen into the grasp of foolish leaders. We mostly addressed this in number 2 above, but here we go from reigns of mankind in number 2 to reigns of every community here in number 6. This makes corruption and foolishness way too close to home. You have to live with or next to some of these foolish people, or even work with or for them. Persia, when the Bab and Baha'u'llah appeared in the mid-1800s, was fraught with low-level community leaders who were corrupt and ignorant. You may be interested in watching the movie Idiocracy. It's about a nation that has given up on education, science, logic, even thinking at all. Thank goodness we aren't as bad as what this comedy science fiction movie depicts, but with people rejecting science and choosing to believe everything Q tells them these days, we may not be far off. Checking off this one as more oppression and affliction being common in our world at this time, as well as when the Bab and Baha'u'llah appeared. Number 7, on their tongue the mention of God hath become an empty name. Once God has sent a new manifestation of himself to humankind, those who reject the teachings of the new Messiah, continuing to present themselves as speaking of and especially for God, no longer have divine guidance and backing. Thus their words are empty. If we look around us, I think we can see many instances when people use God's name without the least intention of actually abiding by God's laws. Religions have gotten a bad reputation, chiefly because of failures of some of their followers to act in accordance with the love their faith calls for, and for them to have and display, or the adherents to these faiths skew the meanings of their scriptures to suit their earthly desires. Checking off this one too. Baha'u'llah's explanation of Jesus' prophecy of the conditions of humankind at the time of the end of the age have been confirmed. Also, for your information, Paul in the New Testament in 2 Timothy chapter 3 verses 1 through 9 describes the terrible times that will come in the latter days. Again, that is around the year 1844 through our time. Quote, "But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power." Have nothing to do with these people. They are the kind who worm their way into homes and gain control over gullible women who are loaded down with sins and swayed by all kinds of evil desires, always learning but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so also these teachers oppose the truth. They are men of depraved minds, who as far as the faith is concerned are rejected, but they will not get very far because, as in the case of those men, their folly will be clear to everyone." End quote. Note that Jannes and Jambres were, according to Jewish lore and texts, magicians, perhaps Egyptian priests who opposed Moses. Is there oppression afoot in the world? I think we can probably agree that it existed in the 1800s in Persia and elsewhere, and it exists even up to our times. Even more importantly, when might it end? This is an excerpt from that letter from Paul in 1 Timothy that was just read, quote, "always learning but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth." And remember Baha'u'llah stating that Matthew 24's text, meaning Jesus, actually said that oppression would be rampant at the end of the age. Then Baha'u'llah explained, quote, "What oppression is more grievous than that a soul seeking the truth and wishing to attain unto the knowledge of God should know not where to go for it and from whom to seek it?" End quote. Basically, people cannot find the truth, meaning they cannot find good, uncorrupted sources of information, people or media, that can help them realize spiritual verities. That is the case today. How many people or media ever bring up the fact that there is a group of people in the world who say that the Messiah has returned and they should investigate the claims? Practically none. And people have been so trained to consider every such claim is from a false Messiah or prophet that no one even tries to investigate such claims. A new religion? This Baha'i faith? No, that's intentional mispronunciation. Must be a cult. Don't bother investigating it for yourself, in other words. But would that news media would let people know that the Messiah has come? In case you didn't realize it, this is a mock newspaper, not a real one, much as I might wish it to be real. And nowadays we all have great issues with facts and anti-facts in both the public and private spheres of our lives, whether from the media or from personal interactions with friends, family members, and people we meet out in the world. I say anti-facts because in many cases these days, lies, half-truths, and withholding of needed true information are weapons wielded by some against society. What are the anti-facts weapons? It's intentional spreading of lies. One could also call them non-facts, but never call them alternate facts. And/or intentional distorting, hiding, or withholding of facts, including giving half-truths. Anti-facts destabilize and undermine a society by subverting and thus weakening government, international, religious, business, academic, scientific, educational, and personal decisions, and relationships at all levels. Non-facts are deadly poison, people. The wielders of these anti-facts are those addressed in verse 28, quote, "Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather," end quote. These vultures are the voracious beasts mentioned by Baha'u'llah in this quote from his book, the Kitab-i-Igan, that means the Book of Certitude in English, quote, "Were the eye to be anointed and illumined with the collyrium of the knowledge of God, it would surely discover that a number of voracious beasts have gathered and preyed upon the carrion of the souls of men." Why mention facts, lies, anti-fact weapons? The most important decisions in life are those that bear on whether you recognize and decide to follow or not follow God's manifestations. Moses, Buddha, Krishna, Zoroaster, Jesus, Muhammad, and his latest, the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Seekers need truthful and accessible information in order to make these most important decisions in their lives. Information such as news that a person in the world has claimed that she or he is a new manifestation of God. Where to get verified information about the claimants to messiahship so the seekers can make their own decisions. And when additional verified information becomes known about such claimants, that could affect the seeker's investigation. And yes, that might mean that some false prophets and messiahs are given some airtime, so to speak. But the media also has an obligation of giving verified information about the background and character of all such claimants. Recent TV shows about Scientology may be an example of what the media can do to highlight possible reasons for seekers to not consider Scientology. Note, I'm not saying this show was a so-called fair and balanced discussion of Scientology, but it does appear to be information that people need to know to make their decisions about their spiritual lives. You may be wondering what the bottom line is here. The question, when will this oppression end, was already raised, so what's the answer? The oppression or tribulation will only be lessened by humankind abiding by the guidance and laws brought by God's latest manifestations, the Bab and Baha'u'llah. That doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has to become a Baha'i, just that the laws that Baha'u'llah brought to us need to be put into action. I'll give some highlights of what some of those laws and guidance include next. Here are 9 of some basic teachings of Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith. Number 1, there is only one God. He's the God of all the monotheistic faiths on earth. The oneness of humankind, the equality of women and men, the independent investigation of truth, the elimination of prejudice, the unity of science and religion, economic justice, abolishing the extremes of poverty and wealth. An auxiliary language must be selected by the nations of the earth to become an international auxiliary language. And Baha'u'llah counseled humanity on how to achieve world peace. Several, but not all 9 of these major teachings will be explained in some slides to follow. God has an unending love for his creation, all of us on earth. And just like a young child begins his or her schooling in kindergarten, then to first grade, then to second grade, etc., his or her teachers at each level may have the same education themselves. The limit of what they're taught is not the teachers, but rather the ability level of the child. What this means is God sends the manifestation of his attributes or prophet with the revelation that is appropriate for a certain people in their place, time, and spiritual capabilities. These prophets or manifestations of God are perfect mirrors that unerringly reflect to those people the divine attributes of God. Here's a rather colorful depiction that God's light shines on all humanity, and He never left any of His creation without divine guidance. And just FYI, to clarify, we Baha'is are not saying that the sun of our solar system is God. The sun in this diagram is symbolic of God. The rays of the sun shine upon us on earth, allegorically similar to how God's spiritual divine light shines upon us. Don't take this too literally here. Teaching number 3, women and men are equal. Male and female are equal in the sight of God and should have equal opportunities on His earth. This quote from Abdu'l-Baha gives a good analogy of this teaching. Quote, "The world of humanity has two wings. One is women and the other men. Not until both wings are equally developed can the bird fly. Should one wing remain weak, flight is impossible. Not until the world of women becomes equal to the world of men in the acquisition of virtues and perfections can success and prosperity be attained as they ought to be." Major teaching number 4, the independent investigation of truth is a requirement for all people. There is no clergy, priests, nuns, and the like in the Baha'i faith. Humanity has progressed to a spiritual stage where such mediators between an individual and God are no longer needed. We are the captains of our own spiritual ships, so to speak. We are individually responsible for our own spiritual advancement and must not blindly follow traditions, movements, and the opinions of others. Adults are to educate their children in the writings, spiritual behaviors, praying, and the like, and principles of the Baha'i faith, but it remains for the child to decide for him or herself after the age of 15 whether or when they become a Baha'i. Number 6 on our list of the major teachings of Baha'u'llah, science and religion are in unity. They agree. Science without religion becomes mundane materialism, and religion without science becomes mere superstition. And if religion weakens so much over time, becoming increasingly divorced from science and fact, in other words, becomes mere superstition, materialism grows in influence. Then you end up with malignant materialism, which I personally believe we as a society have come to in the last few decades. Again, that's just my opinion. This is the stage of materialism that reduces humans to being viewed as mere economic units rather than as individual people with intrinsic worth. And the people with the most material wealth have motives to accrue such wealth, and who lack moral restraints from taking advantage, preying upon those who don't have wealth or power, will destroy the feelings of community and societal cohesiveness. Teaching number 7, and this is about economic justice. Baha'u'llah counsels us that we must, as a society, abolish the extremes of poverty and wealth. Cooperation must replace competition as the basis of an organized economic activity. Baha'u'llah's laws accept the rights of private ownership of property and the need for private economic initiative. He calls for establishment of a minimum income level that meets basic human needs. He also calls for progressive taxation to fund the building and maintenance of an ever-advancing civilization. Now for the 9th major teaching of the Baha'i Faith, that Baha'u'llah came with a plan for world peace, just like the Jewish scriptures promised that the Messiah of the latter days would do. The new Messiah, Baha'u'llah, sent out a call to all rulers and kings in tablets he wrote to them. He wrote general tablets to all rulers as well as some tablets to specific rulers. Some of those rulers he wrote to were the Tsar of Russia, the King of Prussia, Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, Napoleon III, Pope Pius IX, the Shah of Persia, and the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Baha'u'llah called on these rulers to make peace with one another and to end their accumulations of military weaponry. Those rulers ignored his counsels. The only one to give an open-handed response was Queen Victoria. Note that Queen Victoria is the only one of those rulers to retain her throne and territories. Many of the rulers in the Middle East at the time of and shortly thereafter lost their crowns too. World War I happened shortly after the passing of Baha'u'llah in 1892. This war caused great changes in almost every nation and its rulers on earth, in keeping with that vision in Daniel chapter 2 of the kings having their kingdoms destroyed in the latter days. Baha'u'llah has counseled humanity on how to achieve world peace. Humanity must establish a world parliament whose members must be elected by the people in their respective countries, and whose election shall be confirmed by their respective governments, and a supreme tribunal whose judgment will have a binding effect even in such cases where the parties concerned did not voluntarily agree to submit their case to its consideration. And in the words of Baha'u'llah, O concourse of the sovereigns of the world, for thereby will the tempest of discord be stilled amongst you, and your peoples find rest. Should any one among you take up arms against another, rise ye all against him, for this is naught but manifest justice. End quote. So for the oppression, distress, tribulation, whatever you call it, to end, these teachings of Baha'u'llah must become the standard for the peoples of the world, now not forced on them, but chosen through consensus, because they truly are needed to establish justice and peace in the world. Verse 22, quote, If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. End quote. Verse 22 ends with, But for the sake of the elect, those days of oppression will be shortened. Who are the elect? Followers of the new Messiah, those who had the spiritual insight to recognize God's latest manifestation through all the clouds obscuring him from view. Also others who live together in love and unity, according to Abdu'l-Baha in his book, The Promulgation of Universal Peace. Those days would be cut short. The oppression would end before the complete spiritual disintegration of humankind. And for the sake of, those who do respond to the new Messiah are rewarded by God for their devotion by his shortening the period of oppression before humankind self-destructs. That would principally be due to their spreading the good news throughout the world and helping to enlighten the societies in which they live of God's new guidance for this new age or era. How are the days of oppression shortened? And a reminder that oppression is defined by Baha'u'llah as being caused by those people who seek the truth, cannot find it because of the many forces in the world which hides or prevents people from finding the truth. So, the oppression ends when the Messiah brings the truth of his new revelation from God and his followers begin to live and teach it. But that also depends on there being people who see and hear God's message and respond to it by believing and spreading the message further. Just a note here to let you know that verses 23 through 26 inclusive will be explained in section 5b of this video, which is in the part 2 video of the two-part set of videos on chapter 24. It is included in 5b because, of course, there's no prophecies in it, but rather instructions and warnings about these future events that were revealed by Jesus in chapter 24. So now let's hone in on this verse from Matthew 24, verse 27. Quote, "For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." End quote. From the east was prophetic in that both the Bab and Baha'u'llah were born in Persia, directly east of where Jesus spoke these words. Their faith, the Baha'i faith, spread quickly from this eastern location west to the Holy Land and beyond the Holy Land to the west, including Europe, North and South America, then the entire globe. You've seen this map before. Here I'll show you that Baha'u'llah and the Bab came from the east of the Holy Land, exactly as foretold by Jesus in verse 27. The Bab, born in Shiraz, Persia, that's in the lower right of the map, made his initial declaration of his divine identity in Shiraz. He also made more public proclamations in the central part of Persia, and his disciples traveled throughout Persia to spread the good news. After the Bab was martyred, killed by the Persian army in July of 1850, his body was hidden for several decades. Then in the early 1900s, his earthly remains were secretly moved to Mount Carmel in the Holy Land, where they were interred in his shrine. Baha'u'llah was born in Tehran, Persia in 1819. After he became a follower of the Bab, he too suffered the persecutions as the Babis were by the government and clergy. He was exiled by order of the king and went to Baghdad, which was in the Ottoman Empire. Baha'u'llah spent about 10 years in that location, then was exiled by order of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire 3 additional times, ultimately being incarcerated in the prison city of Akka, Palestine, in the Holy Land. Thus they did indeed come from the east of the Holy Land and go to the west. After the Bab's proclamation that he was the promised one of Islam and the herald of the Messiah who would shortly appear, his followers, called Babis, spread the word with lightning swiftness. The Babi faith quickly spread. It was thought that there may have been a couple 100,000 Babis by the time of his martyrdom in 1850. Once Baha'u'llah announced his divine identity in 1863 in Baghdad, most of the Babis became Baha'is, that is, followers of Baha'u'llah. This new faith of God, the Baha'i faith, was openly proclaimed, although many do not yet know of its existence. Some have heard of it, but do not really know anything of its teachings. There are now over 10 million members in only about 178 years since 1844. It has spread all over the world, with about 170,000 of us in the USA. And this from Michael Sowers from his book, The Prophecies of Jesus. Quote, "The words like lightning suggest the open visibility of Baha'u'llah's proclamation, its startling nature, and the speed of its development. It is a sudden bright light amidst a storm, carrying a forceful message." End quote. On to verse 28, quote, "Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather." End quote. Another quote from Michael Sowers' book that contains a quote from Baha'u'llah. Quote, "In Baha'u'llah's discourse on Matthew chapter 24 verses 29 and 30, he speaks of the tribulation as a time when the leaders of religion in particular, like voracious beasts, have gathered and preyed upon the carrion of the souls of men. If the vultures are corrupt leaders exploiting the lost souls of humankind, then this is an inevitable condition which, as Scripture indicates, must precede the second advent, a subject which the next verse, verse 29, anticipates. End quote. And here is that next verse, verse 29, quote, "Immediately after the distress or oppression of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken." End quote. In the King James version, the first phrase of that verse is immediately after the tribulation of those days, etc. Note that the most obvious difference between the New International Version and the King James Version is that instead of the word distress, the King James Version uses the word tribulation. And then remember that Baha'u'llah, the new Messiah, said that this passage would be more correct if it said immediately after the oppression of those days, the sun will be darkened, etc. This prophecy can also be seen in the Old Testament, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 13, verses 9 and 10. Quote, "Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, cruel, and full of wrath and fierce anger, to make the earth a desolation, and to destroy the sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in its going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine." End quote. You can see the same terms are used, the stars of heaven, plus it also mentions the constellations thereof. The sun darkened, the moon shall not shine. But of special importance, at the very beginning of verse 9 of this chapter of Isaiah, it states, "The day of the Lord cometh." The day of the Lord is the appearance of a manifestation of God, the Messiah. And Jesus said it would also be the end of his age, thus the beginning of a new age or era. And Daniel said that it would occur in the year 1844. We need to recognize the intersections of prophecies, especially intersections with time prophecies. Isaiah states these same events signal the day of the Lord, the coming of a manifestation of God. Daniel gave us the year of 1844 Common Era. Daniel chapter 4 verse 25 and verse 32 foretells the 7 times prophecy of 2520 years before the end of a period of punishment, which ended in 1844. The Zohar tells us that 400 years before the start of the 7th millennium, meaning after the year 1840 Common Era, Jewish year 5601, the world would see the appearance of the Messiah. The Zohar is a Jewish mystical compilation widely read and accepted by those who are into Jewish mysticism. It is not accepted by all Jews, though. In these verses, Jesus is kind of giving a timeline, and I believe it fits in with the time prophecies in Daniel, the book of Revelation, and the 7 times prophecy in Daniel chapter 4, mentioned at the beginning of this video in section 3, and in my time prophecy video titled Christ Has Returned. So we start here with a timeline, the orange line in the middle. Time marches on from left to right. Matthew states that after the distress or oppression of those days, these events will occur. Now, there is no direct evidence that Jesus meant that each element of the prophecies happens in the order they are listed here. It's possible, but not definite. But for sure, he mentions that all these would happen before the end of the age. The end of the age is 1844 because the Bible said so, as we've discussed in section 3. As we go through these elements of the prophecy, I'll cover the possible literal fulfillment of these prophecies. Then I'll review the spiritual or symbolic fulfillments of these same prophecies. So after the distress or oppression begins, then all the below events happen, but we don't know if they happen in this chronological order or not. The sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, the stars falling from the sky, and heavenly bodies being shaken. Are these prophecies to be fulfilled literally or symbolically? These 4 prophecies are some of the more anticipated events of all the prophecies of the return of the Messiah. Are we to expect their literal fulfillment, symbolic fulfillment, or both? In this presentation, we will present evidence that there was fulfillment of both the literal and the symbolic interpretations of these prophecies before the proclamations of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, providing strong evidence that they are indeed the latest manifestations of God sent to guide humankind anew. You can then choose if you believe in the literal, the symbolic, both, or neither. We start with the literal fulfillment. Christians in both the USA and Europe noted the literal fulfillment of these prophecies in the late 1700s to early and mid-1800s. Combined with their discovery of the meaning of the 2300-day prophecy and the literal fulfillment of these 4 prophecies, a huge movement named the Great Awakening surged in the early 1800s. Part of that Great Awakening was what was called the Advent movement. Part of the Great Awakening included the expected return of Christ, the Messiah, to come down out of the sky and land at their feet in or near the year 1844. For your information, see the video titled Christ Has Returned by me. It's on my channel, Integral Destiny 9. It's the YouTube channel. And to learn more about it, see the bottom bullet mark there. We will start with these 2 elements of the prophecies. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light. On May 19, 1780, there was a widely noted dark day that was not due to an eclipse. The event was included in the 1883 edition of Webster's Unabridged Dictionary. Quote, "The dark day, May 19, 1780, so called on account of a remarkable darkness on that day extending all over New England. The true cause of this remarkable phenomenon is not known." End quote. The darkness started at about noon. It extended from New England down the eastern seacoast to northern New Jersey. Many observers at the time and scientists tracking eclipses since have documented that it was not an eclipse, lunar or solar. When the moon appeared later that day, it was the color of blood. About that dark day of 1780 in New England, a noted physicist, William R. Corliss, included the event in his book titled Unusual Natural Phenomena, Eyewitness Accounts of Nature's Greatest Mysteries. Published in 1983, it includes a description of this event from some eyewitnesses, one of which was Nathan Reed, a student at Harvard College who made these notes. 10:30 a.m., uncommon degree of darkness commenced. 11 a.m., darkness still increasing. Mr. Wigglesworth not able to read in a large Bible by a window. Fowls go to roost as at evening. At 12:21, darkness still increasing. Mr. W not able to read the running title of a large Bible. Candles are in common use. Frogs pipe and evening birds sing. The Hartford, Connecticut legislature was in session that day. This entry into the journal of the legislature, quote, "None could see to read or write in the house, or even at a window. At 11 o'clock adjourned the house till 2 o'clock." End quote. Some remarks were recorded wondering if it was the Day of Judgment. There is another prophecy about the time of the end, about a dark day to come, that intersects here, from the book of Joel, chapter 2, verse 31, quote, "The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord come." End quote. From the context of some other Bible verses, we know that the term Day of the Lord means the coming of a prophet or manifestation of God. We may wonder what the possible cause or causes there were for this event and similar ones. Mr. Corliss, a physicist, believes that the following are some possible causes for such events: forest fires, volcanic activity, intense storms, stratospheric or extraterrestrial cloud of obscuring matter, such as an asteroid belt. In Mr. Corliss's book, he describes several other dark days which have been reported, as you see here in this table, some with known causes, others suspected, and some absolutely unknown cause. Now, Jesus did not say that the dark day he foretold would be due to known or unknown causes. There's nothing to preclude any of these from being the dark day he spoke of, or perhaps none of them are. Note that the Tambora volcanic explosion in 1815, just 2 years before the birth of Baha'u'llah and 4 years before the birth of the Bab, is one of the events causing dark days, and will also be mentioned shortly when we speak of Jesus foretelling earthquakes. Also note that Jesus did not limit the dark day to any particular geographical area, if we take this prophecy literally. It's kind of odd that Mr. Corliss had no examples of dark days after 1886 in his book, which was first published in 1983. He mentions that there have been dark days, but he thinks nowadays they are dismissed because people generally surmise that they are due to pollution or smoke. We certainly have seen such conditions lately with so many forest fires in many areas of our globe, apparently due to or contributed to by climate change. This map shows the location of the Tambora volcano in Indonesia. And you can also see where the ash cloud extended to as a result of the explosion of this volcano, up through the Middle East, into Russia even, Europe, across the Atlantic Ocean to even parts of the east coast of the North American continent. And this ash cloud caused some dark days, at least in some areas, some darkened days. Note that the ash lingered in the atmosphere so long that the following summer season in Europe in 1816 was called the Year Without Summer because of the temperature effects of the climate for the entire summer. It also caused crop failures, famines, an increase in cholera cases, and even emigration changes. The blast of the explosion was reportedly heard up to 1,400 miles away. Could that blast have been the trumpet blast announcing the coming of a manifestation of God appearing on the planet? Why not? This illustration shows some of the effects of the Tambora volcano explosion in 1815. You can pause the video and read some of the notes if you wish. But what about the moon being darkened too? Well, if the sun is obscured and you cannot see the sun due to whatever caused the dark day, you likely would not be able to see the moon either. Remember, the moon is visible because the sun's rays are reflected from its surface. Presumably, if the sun's rays cannot reach the earth, it is possible that the sun's rays may not be reflected off the moon as well. Thus, the sun being darkened to our eyesight, it could possibly cause the moon to be darkened too. Plus, in some of these instances, it was described that the moon turned to the color of blood, meaning that it was darkened. So we will count both the darkening of the sun and the moon, turning the color of blood, thus not giving us light, prophecies as being literally fulfilled before 1844. Next, we move on to the third part of verse 29. The stars will fall from the sky. We know now what they did not know in the time of Jesus, that the stars that are seen in the sky are enormously larger than our planet. I'm sure that Jesus knew that, but the people he was talking to at the time and many centuries thereafter would not have any conception of that. We know that if the stars in the heavens would fall to earth, it would be like 1,000 million Himalayan mountains falling on a mustard seed. Physically impossible. In order to take a literal interpretation of this prophecy, we will have to restrict our definition of a star to things like meteors, comets, and asteroids, and other such objects out there. Any physical body not a star, sun, or moon. That would not obliterate our planet should it fall to the surface of the earth. It would have to be the size limit. The stars will fall from the sky. Well, that was fulfilled by the star fall of 1833. This well-documented event was considered the most extensive falling star event ever recorded. An estimate of the rate of star fall meteors was in excess of 34,640 per hour. This is a 19th century depiction of the star fall of 1833. Now there was another star fall in 1866, just after the proclamation by Baha'u'llah that he is the Messiah of the latter days. It was of a far less intensity than the 1833 event, which happened before the declaration of the Bab. So the 1833 event announced the coming of the Bab. The 1866 event occurred around the time that Baha'u'llah declared his being the Messiah, and that was his announcement there. As reported in the book by William Sears titled Thief in the Night, the American Journal of Science gave this report about the starfall of 1833. Quote, "Though there was no moon, when we first observed them, their brilliancy was so great that we could at times read common-sized print without much difficulty, and the light which they afforded was much whiter than that of the moon in the clearest and coldest night, when the ground is covered with snow." End quote. Baha'u'llah, in his book titled Epistle to the Son of Wolf, confirmed that the starfall of 1866 did fulfill the Bible prophecies about the stars falling. Quote, "Have the stars fallen? Say, yea, when he who is the self-subsisting dwelt in the land of mystery," meaning Adrianople. "Take heed, ye who are endued with discernment." End quote. Baha'u'llah was speaking of the starfall of 1866, since that was when he was living in exile in the city of Adrianople. We will count the stars falling from the sky, prophecies as being literally fulfilled. So we have shown how numbers 1 through 3 have been literally fulfilled. So on to number 4, the heavenly bodies will be shaken. For the remainder of the verse 29 explanation and lots more, please go to part 2 of this 2-part video series on this topic of Matthew 24. It's on my YouTube channel, which the name of that is Integral Destiny 9. That is in the green box there, Integral Destiny 9. Now, to end this video, I have included some information resources if you want to learn more about the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and or their faith, the Baha'i faith. if you aren't going to go to part 2. You can get it here. It's also at the end of part 2. So if you want to just stop here and go on to part 2, that'd be great. You'll still get this information at the end of part 2. See you at part 2. The next several slides give some information sources to find out more about the Baha'i Faith, its history, founders, laws, etc. Included are videos, websites, and some books. I recommend that you watch this professionally produced 30-minute video on the life of Baha'u'llah and the start of the Baha'i Faith as an introduction. Its title is The Prisoner of Akka. To access this video, go to YouTube and to the channel named Baha'i Vision, as you see at the bottom of the slide, and look for the video by that name, The Prisoner of Akka. You may also just be able to enter the title into the YouTube search box, The Prisoner of Akka, and then look for this exact title. A great way to get authoritative insight into the mission of the Bab and the history of the beginnings of the new faith called the Baha'i Faith, this professionally produced documentary brings to life the opening drama of the continuance of the greatest story ever told. Its title is The Gate, Dawn of the Baha'i Faith. It's available for free on YouTube, and it's about 1 hour in length. The easiest way to get to it on YouTube is to, you get to YouTube first, youtube.com, and then you enter into the search box at the top the name of the channel, and that's at the bottom right-hand corner of the slide here. That channel is The Gate Film, all one word, with no spaces between. The Gate Film. Note that there are numerous versions in a variety of languages, so you want to make sure you select a version in the language of your choice. And this video about the life of Abdu'l-Baha, known as the Center of the Covenant and the Exemplar in the Baha'i Faith. Remember, he's the branch foretold in the Bible prophecy. Go to YouTube through youtube.com, and into the search box on that website, enter the channel name Baha'i Perspective, BAHA' Perspective, as shown in the bottom right. Then on their page, scroll down to find the video titled Exemplar. It's 55 minutes in length, but it's so well done that the time passes very quickly. Now this video is a must-watch. It's titled Christ Has Returned. It's one of my videos on my channel that you see at the bottom there, Integral Destiny 9. It explains in detail Bible time prophecies that tell when the Messiah of the latter days, the returned Christ, would appear, and how the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and the Baha'i Faith fulfill those time prophecies. Here are some official Baha'i websites. Top one there is www.bahai.org. That's the international official website for those seeking information about the Baha'i Faith, and it has a link to the online library of sacred and authoritative texts that are accessible for free. Next is www.bahai.us. That's the USA official website for seekers who want information about the Baha'i community in the United States. Then we have bahai.org/library, and that is access, again, free to the sacred and authoritative texts and other publications by worldwide Baha'i community. Then at the bottom, the USA bookstore, that's BahaiBookstore.com. It's the official online bookstore for the USA. You can purchase books, videos, music, and some other items through this site as well. You don't have to be a Baha'i to purchase things. The National Organization of the Baha'is of the United States has a presence on both Facebook and its own YouTube channel. Both of their pages in these websites goes by the name Baha'is of the United States. More websites. Top one, Baha'u'llah.org. This is a blog site where you can find numerous articles written about subjects touching on the Baha'i faith and the teachings. It's not an official site, but rather is produced by some individual Baha'is. There's a variety of topics in here, so if you have any specific topic, you can go on there and try to find articles to enlighten you what the view from the Baha'i faith might be. Next is the access address to the YouTube channel of the Wilmette Institute, which is an online Baha'i educational site that has webinars and actual online courses. Some are free and some at a cost, on a wide spectrum of Baha'i topics. The easiest way to get there is to go to youtube.com, then in the search box put their channel name, which is, as you see there, Wilmette Institute. We have a Baha'i World News Service which can be reached through the website you see there, https://news.baha'i.org. And then to read some examples of some Baha'i prayers, go to www.bahaiprayers.org. If you'd like to find a book that gives a good, interesting overview of the Baha'i faith, its main figures, history, beliefs, and its followers, without being preachy or trying to convert you, this is the book for you. Its title is Baha'u'llah and the New Era by the author J.E. Esselmont. It's available through Amazon.com and probably other online book vendors too. It may even be in your local library or your local independent bookstore. Here's a list of many of my other videos, all on YouTube, mostly on prophecy fulfillment by the main four founding figures of the Baha'i faith. You can read the titles. There's a variety of topics. Pause the video to review them to see if any might interest you. Instructions on how to access them, all for free, on YouTube is on the next slide. Here's how to find my videos on YouTube. You have to get to YouTube first in the first method, and that is www.youtube.com. You get to the site, and in the search box on that site you enter my channel name of Integral Destiny 9. You see they're all one word, no spaces between, with the number 9 at the end. Or you can simply put the URL into the search box of your, like Google, whatever, www.youtube.com/c/ then my YouTube channel Integral Destiny 9, as you see there, and that should get you directly there, so I understand. And you'll see a list of videos, and you just have to roam around on my channel and find those videos. A really great book on the prophecies of Jesus in chapter 24 of the book of Matthew is this one by Michael Sowers, titled The Prophecies of Jesus. His scholarly, yet very easily read and understood book was a great source of information and helped enormously in my understanding of the Bible. I highly recommend it. It's available through Amazon.com. The web address is at the bottom, but there are other internet bookstores or maybe even your local bookstore. I do want to push independent bookstores for their business. Please note that this video is an amateur production by this singular person, me. It is not an official production of the Baha'i faith community. Copyright protections are claimed. Please do not make changes, additions, or deletions to this presentation. Questions? Contact me at the email address you see there, and of course, thanks for watching. Bye.